The wind over northern Hungary carried a chill older than memory. It swept through valleys where forests whispered of ghosts, over rivers that once ran red with war, and finally reached the black silhouette of Csejte Castle, a fortress of stone and shadow. There, among the Carpathian mists, history had carved a wound that would never heal. They called her the Blood Countess. But monsters are never born, they are made. Tonight, the firelight flickers on her portrait, a woman with eyes like polished obsidian. Her beauty both divine and cruel. Her name still echoes through centuries. Elizabeth Bathory, noble, widow, ruler, murderer, or martyr of her own legend. 400 years ago, in a world torn between faith and fear, she ruled with a grace that masked an empire of silence. Servants vanished. Priests whispered of sins too dark for confession. And in the corridors of her castle, behind locked doors, the scent of blood lingered like perfume. But beneath every myth lies a truth, and beneath every truth, a deeper darkness. Was Elizabeth Bathory a sadist who believed blood could preserve her youth? Or was she a victim of politics, condemned by men who feared the power of a woman who could not be controlled? The story you are about to hear is not only about a murderer, it is about a world where cruelty was law, faith was a weapon, and beauty itself became a curse. From the ashes of war to the velvet halls of nobility, from whispered prayers to screams in the dark, this is the story of how one woman became Europe's most enduring nightmare. So, turn down the lights, listen closely, and remember, in history, there are no monsters, only people who forget what mercy means. You're watching Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess. Like, share, and subscribe for history's darkest truths. The year was 1560, and the Kingdom of Hungary was bleeding. From the south, the crescent banners of the Ottoman Empire pressed against its borders, fire and steel sweeping across villages, churches, and vineyards. From the west, the Habsburg dynasty demanded loyalty in the name of Christ and crown. Between these two giants lay a land divided, haunted by war, superstition, and ambition. And it was in this land, amid the clash of empires and faiths, that a child was born into the most powerful family of the realm. A child whose name would one day be whispered with dread: Elizabeth Bathory. The Bathorys were not merely nobles. They were a dynasty of predators. For generations they had ruled over Transylvania and Upper Hungary, their bloodline tangled with princes, bishops, and warriors. Their sigil, a pair of dragon teeth upon crimson, was said to symbolize both protection and vengeance. They were famed for their loyalty to the crown, but also for their ruthless pursuit of power. Elizabeth's father, Baron George Bathory, was a stern man of war, cold, calculating, a commander who believed mercy was a weakness. Her mother, Anna Bathory, came from a branch of the same bloodline, sealing their power through marriage. In the echoing halls of the Bathory estate, Elizabeth was raised not with lullabies, but with the clamor of politics, the scent of iron, and the screams of those who disobeyed. At the time of her birth, Hungary was scarred by plague and invasion. Villages burned under Ottoman raids. Men vanished into conscription or slavery. Within castle walls, nobles clung to ancient rituals, believing that blood and prayer could ward off the darkness creeping from the east. Elizabeth's cradle was carved from black walnut, her first toy, a silver cross. But from her window, she saw things that no child should see. Down in the courtyard, soldiers dragged prisoners, rebels, thieves, or servants accused of disobedience to the whipping post. Their cries rose through the air like a second kind of prayer. Sometimes, her father watched from the balcony, sipping wine as though cruelty were a lesson in discipline. And little Elizabeth watched too. She did not flinch. By the age of 6, she spoke 4 languages: Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek. Tutors praised her intelligence, calling her a mind sharpened by flame. But there was something else beneath that brilliance, a quiet detachment, a fascination with control, with the delicate boundary between pain and obedience. One winter's day, when frost coated the windows like lace, Elizabeth found a wounded servant girl in the stables. The girl's hands were swollen, frostbitten, after being punished for stealing bread. Elizabeth stared at her not with cruelty, but with curiosity. "Does it hurt?" she asked. The girl nodded weakly. Elizabeth reached out, touched her hand, the skin cold, raw, trembling, and whispered, almost to herself, "Then it means you're still alive." The servant died that night. Elizabeth didn't cry. Instead, she watched the candle burn down to its end and asked her nurse how long it took for souls to leave the body. Her nurse, a superstitious old woman named Dorothea, told her that souls lingered near the living sometimes for days. Elizabeth began to leave pieces of bread on her windowsill, whispering to the spirits she imagined hovered nearby. She grew up believing that death was not the end, merely another room in the same castle. When she turned 10, her uncle sent her to live for a time in the court of Transylvania, among the most influential nobles of the age. There, she saw another kind of power, refined, political, adorned with jewels and deception. She learned that beauty was a weapon, that words could wound more deeply than blades. At 12, she was promised in marriage to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a match that would unite two of Hungary's greatest houses. Ferenc was older, hardened by years of battle against the Ottomans. They called him the Black Hero of Hungary, a man whose armor never gleamed because it was always stained with blood. Elizabeth met him only once before their wedding. He kissed her hand, smiled with the confidence of a conqueror, and said, "May our enemies fear your name as they fear mine." She smiled back. "Then they already do." Even as a child, she understood the meaning of alliance and the currency of fear. But beneath her grace, the girl carried within her something fractured, a silence that no affection could break. She had seen the cruelty of her world and had mistaken it for strength. At night, she sometimes woke screaming, though she could never remember the dreams. Servants whispered that she had visions of blood running down the walls, of women screaming in the forest. Her mother brought priests to bless her chamber, but Elizabeth only smiled when the incense burned, as though she could see something the holy men could not. Outside, Hungary bled on. Ottoman banners burned towns. The plague swept through the countryside. Yet within the marble halls of the Bathory estates, life remained gilded. Banquets, hunting feasts, and sermons filled the days. Elizabeth learned to dance, to charm, to command. She rode horses better than most men. She studied medicine, astrology, and the strange alchemy of herbs, knowledge rare for a woman. In one of her letters, preserved centuries later, she wrote, "In our world, God may forgive the sinner, but never the weak." It was not a child's thought. It was a philosophy. By the time she was 14, she could quote the scriptures as easily as she could describe the anatomy of pain. Her tutors adored her intellect but feared her temper. When one of them scolded her for disobedience, she calmly ordered her maid to spill ink on his robes, not out of spite, but to remind him that he, too, could be stained. In her eyes, power was not inherited, it was exercised. And so the girl who watched the punished servants in her courtyard grew into a young woman who understood both beauty and fear, and the thin thread that tied them together. By the time her marriage approached, Elizabeth Bathory had already become a legend among nobles, the prodigy of the Bathorys, a woman whose eyes saw more than they should, whose composure never cracked. But legends have roots, and hers were watered with blood, pride, and silence. As the bells of the Nadasdy estate rang for her arrival, Elizabeth looked out across the frostbitten landscape and whispered to herself, "I was born among dragons. I will die among ghosts." The bells of Vienna and Pressburg told that spring of 1574, when Elizabeth Bathory, 14 years old, was escorted by a procession of nobles and priests toward her wedding. It was not a union of love, but of empires. The House of Bathory and the House of Nadasdy had forged a bond that would shape Hungary's fate for generations. The ceremony took place in Vranov, under vaulted ceilings painted with saints and swords. Elizabeth wore a gown of deep crimson, embroidered with gold thread that shimmered like veins beneath the fabric. Her hair was braided with pearls. Her face, pale and still, betrayed nothing. Ferenc Nadezhdy, 10 years her senior, stood beside her like a living monument of war. His hands were calloused, his gaze unwavering, his presence the embodiment of masculine authority. Yet, when the vows were spoken, witnesses said it was Elizabeth, not Ferenc, who held his eyes longer, unblinking, as though sealing a pact between two predators. The wedding feast lasted 3 days. Cattle were slaughtered, wine flowed like rivers, and songs of victory echoed through the valley. But beneath the laughter, whispers drifted among the servants, stories of the young bride's strange composure, of her distant smile when a jester accidentally cut himself and blood spotted the floor. Ferenc gifted her Csejte Castle, a fortress perched on the cliffs of modern-day Slovakia, their marital home, their symbol of dominion. Its towers pierced the fog like black fingers. To Elizabeth, it was not a prison but a throne. She entered Csejte as a child of privilege, but soon she would rule it as something far more formidable. A world of fire and iron. Hungary was at war again. Ferenc returned to the battlefield almost immediately, commanding troops against the Ottomans. For years, his name spread across Europe as the Black Hero. His cruelty toward enemies whispered with both awe and horror. He wrote letters to Elizabeth from the front, reports of impaled soldiers, burning villages, and victories paid for in flesh. In reply, Elizabeth sent herbs to heal his wounds and perfumes to mask the stench of death. Yet between them, something colder grew, a shared understanding that violence was not evil. It was order. While Ferenc shed blood for the kingdom, Elizabeth ruled the castle. She managed estates, oversaw servants, settled disputes, collected taxes. Her intelligence astonished the men of court. She spoke to priests and judges as an equal, often correcting them on law and scripture. But the peasants whispered another story. They said the young countess's eyes were too sharp, her commands too swift, her punishments too exacting. A servant who broke a vase was whipped until her skin tore. Another, accused of theft, was forced to stand naked in the snow. Still, none dared complain, for the countess's name carried the weight of noble blood, and in 16th century Hungary, noble blood was law. The shadow of the cross. Elizabeth's education had not ended with marriage. She studied the writings of theologians and alchemists, searching for the boundary between the divine and the forbidden. She read Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa and whispered his words under candlelight. To know the nature of things is to command them. Her fascination with power deepened. She questioned priests on the nature of sin. Is cruelty always evil? She once asked. If it preserves obedience. They hesitated to answer. When she bore her first child, a daughter, she named her Anna, after her mother, though she rarely held the infant herself. Elizabeth preferred to walk the corridors of Csejte, listening to the echo of her footsteps, commanding servants with gestures so subtle they seemed like spells. Outside, the land starved under taxes. Inside, the countess's banquets glowed with gold and silver. Yet even her feasts carried an air of ritual, servants arranged by height, torches placed in perfect symmetry, food served in silence. To those who served her, Elizabeth was both angel and executioner. She rewarded loyalty lavishly. She punished defiance without hesitation. One autumn evening, a maid accidentally spilled wine on the countess's dress. Ferenc's steward begged for leniency, but Elizabeth ordered the girl to be flogged. Ferenc, returning from the front, intervened laughing and taught his wife a soldier's method of discipline. He dipped strips of parchment in oil, wound them around a stick, and set them alight near the girl's feet until she confessed. Elizabeth watched intently. When it was over, she said softly, "You burn to cleanse the sin." Ferenc nodded. "And she'll remember." That night, Elizabeth could not sleep. The scent of burned oil lingered in her mind like perfume. Something within her stirred, not horror, not pity, but curiosity, the mirror of nobility. In the years that followed, Elizabeth became renowned for her beauty, a portrait of perfect composure. Her dark hair, pale skin, and violet-gray eyes made her the envy of courts across Europe. Yet her smile never reached her eyes. Visitors to Csejte Castle spoke of a lady of elegance and intellect, generous to the church, devout in her prayers. But the servants whispered other things, of disappearances, of distant screams muffled by stone. It began perhaps as punishment, or perhaps as fascination. No one truly knows when discipline became ritual. What is known is that Elizabeth's world was one where pain was commonplace, where nobles executed peasants as spectacle, where her own husband bragged of impaling captives for amusement. So, when Elizabeth ordered a servant whipped, it was not seen as monstrous. It was normal, at least at first. But there was something different about her. She watched not with rage, but with a terrible serenity, as though she were studying music or anatomy. She once remarked to her steward, "Fear is the most loyal servant of all." And so Csejte grew quieter. Servants obeyed instantly. Guests stayed shorter. The castle's corridors felt colder. When Ferenc rode home from war, he found his wife changed. Her grace remained, but her tenderness was gone. She spoke of dreams of endless red corridors, of fountains of blood that never dried. Ferenc laughed, telling her it was the devil playing with a beautiful mind. But when he returned to the front lines once more, Elizabeth stood on the battlements and whispered to the wind, "Then the devil will have to kneel." The birth of the myth. In 1575, Elizabeth gave birth to another child, and the nobles celebrated her as a symbol of strength. Yet rumors had already begun to circulate, small, poisonous things whispered among servants and travelers. Some said the Countess kept a book of sins, written in her own blood. Others said she prayed not to God, but to something older, darker. Of course, no one dared speak openly. Her power was untouchable. The Bathory name shielded her like armor. But in the dark corners of taverns, peasants told stories of screams carried on the wind from Csejte Castle, of lights flickering at impossible hours, of maidens who went to serve the Countess and never returned. It would take decades for those whispers to grow into accusations. For now, they were only shadows. Shadows cast by candlelight, by fear, by fascination. And within those shadows, Elizabeth Bathory, the noble child of dragons, began her slow descent into legend. By the late 1572, the Kingdom of Hungary was a land caught between ruin and splendor. War with the Ottoman Empire had stripped villages to bone and ash, while nobles feasted behind fortress walls, pretending the kingdom was not dying around them. Among these nobles, none stood higher or colder than Elizabeth Bathory. Still, in her late teens, she was already a figure of fascination. The child who once watched punishment from the courtyard now commanded a domain of her own. Her husband, Count Ferenc Nadesti, was rarely home. His life belonged to the battlefield. He fought beneath banners stained red and gold, carving his legend into the flesh of men. When he was gone, which was most of the time, Elizabeth ruled everything he left behind. The fortress of Csejte, the surrounding estates, hundreds of servants, and the peasants who worked her land. She ruled with precision, not passion. Each dawn began with ritual. Servants lined the corridors as she passed, eyes lowered, the sound of her steps echoing through the marble hall. Her steward, János Ujvari, followed with ledgers in hand records of taxes, punishments, marriages, and births. Elizabeth examined every entry herself, correcting mistakes with cold efficiency. To her, order was beauty, disobedience, a sin. Peasants whispered that the young countess saw everything. A stolen chicken, a broken tool, a whispered insult, nothing escaped her notice. Those who obeyed her prospered. Those who failed her vanished quietly from the fields. Each Sunday she knelt before the cross in the castle chapel, head bowed beneath the light of candles. The priest spoke of her as a model of devotion, her voice clear and measured in prayer. But behind closed doors, her questions unsettled them. Once she asked her confessor, "If suffering purifies the soul, why do we fear it?" He had hesitated before answering, "Because pain is the mark of sin, my lady." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "And yet Christ suffered. Does that not make pain divine?" That priest never returned to Csejte. When spring came, Elizabeth spent her hours in the castle gardens, an ocean of roses and poppies overlooking the gray hills. She studied herbs, poisons, and the anatomy of plants, memorizing their virtues and venoms. Servants often found her alone at dusk, her fingers stained crimson from crushing petals. She said the color reminded her of life itself. Ferenc visited rarely, bringing with him the stench of war. He would boast of victories, of enemies flayed or impaled, of rivers dyed red. Elizabeth listened quietly, eyes unblinking, as though taking notes. When he laughed, she smiled. When he handed her trophies from the battlefield, a jeweled dagger, an Ottoman banner, a severed ear preserved in wax, she accepted them like offerings to an altar. When night fell, she would stand on the battlements, the torchlight brushing against her pale face, and whisper to the wind, "Blood and soil both feed the earth." Years passed. The Count remained away longer each time. His letters grew cold, filled with reports of plague and famine, of campaigns waged in endless mud. Elizabeth's replies were brief and exact, discussing land, harvests, and servants. The distance between them became permanent, though neither named it. In his absence, Elizabeth grew in influence. Nobles visited her at Csejte, drawn by her intelligence and strange composure. She spoke of philosophy and power with a calm that unsettled the men who came to impress her. They called her the Lady Philosopher of Csejte, a title meant both as praise and warning. Some said she was too clever for a woman. Others whispered that her beauty hid something unholy. But her power made gossip dangerous. The Bathory name shielded her like iron, and even Ferenc, when told of the rumors, laughed. "Let them fear her," he said. "A feared wife guards a husband's throne." Elizabeth had no need for laughter. Fear was her language. She cultivated it with the precision of a gardener pruning roses. The castle grew silent under her rule. Servants moved like ghosts, careful not to meet her gaze. She expected obedience to the breath. Those who disobeyed were punished privately, efficiently, never twice for the same mistake. One winter's evening, a maid spilled wine on the Countess's gown. The steward begged forgiveness, but Elizabeth ordered punishment. When Ferenc returned from war, he found the servants trembling and the girl missing. He laughed at the story, then showed his wife how soldiers extracted confessions from the unwilling. He dipped parchment in oil, wound it around a rod, and set it aflame near another girl's feet. She confessed before the third burn. Elizabeth watched intently, her face serene. When it was done, she said quietly, "You burned to cleanse the sin." Ferenc smiled. "And she'll remember." That night, Elizabeth could not sleep. The smell of oil and burned skin haunted the corridors, and she felt it settle into her lungs like incense. Something in her mind had shifted, quietly but irreversibly. She began to see pain not as chaos, but as structure. It had rhythm, form, and most dangerously purpose. Her world became one of precision. She arranged her servants by height at banquets, by beauty in her chambers. She dictated how many steps they should take between rooms, how low they should bow. She practiced gestures in mirrors, ensuring her smile looked both merciful and terrifying. Csejte Castle became an instrument, and she, its conductor. When Ferenc fell ill from the wounds of war, Elizabeth did not panic. She received word that his legs were paralyzed, that he would never ride again. She ordered priests, doctors, and apothecaries to his bedside. And when he returned, broken and weak, she cared for him herself. Her hands were gentle, but her eyes distant, as though tending to a dying relic of another life. At night, she read scripture to him, verses about penance and the wages of sin. He would try to joke, "You sound more priest than wife," but she would answer softly, "Perhaps the priests never learned what sin truly costs." His death came slow, cruel, and deserved, some said. When it was over, Elizabeth wore black for a year, her veil trailing behind her like smoke. But the mourning seemed ritual, not grief. Beneath the fabric, she glowed with an energy that frightened even her oldest servants. She had shared power with a husband. Now, she commanded it alone. And somewhere within her, A thought began to bloom, a dangerous, intoxicating thought, that beauty could defy time if only one dared enough. It began, they say, with a simple accident. A maid brushed her hair too hard, pulling a strand. Elizabeth struck her across the face. The girl's nose bled, and a few crimson drops splattered across the Countess's hand. Elizabeth froze. The blood shone against her skin like a ruby in candlelight. She stared at it, mesmerized. Later, she told her closest attendant that her skin appeared somehow lighter where the blood had touched it. Perhaps it was imagination. Perhaps it was madness. But the thought lingered, sweet and poisonous. That night, as she looked into her mirror, she touched her cheek where the candlelight fell softest. The reflection stared back ageless, perfect, and, for the first time, hungry. And in the silence of her chambers, with snow falling beyond the stone walls, something ancient in her heart whispered its name. The Blood Countess had been born. Ferenc death marked the end of one era and the birth of another. The bells of Csejte rang for him only once. Afterward, silence returned thick, absolute, and permanent. Elizabeth wore mourning like armor. For months she was seen only in black, a tall figure gliding through stone corridors, her face veiled, her step soundless. The court expected her to fade into grief as noble widows often did. Instead, she rose higher. With Ferenc gone, his lands, wealth, and titles passed entirely to her. She became one of the richest women in the Kingdom of Hungary. The estate stretched across mountains and valleys, her signature now carrying the force of law. Soldiers once loyal to her husband now bent the knee to her. Priests visited her court with trembling hands. For the Countess's favor meant survival and her displeasure, ruin. But power is a strange companion to solitude. It does not console, it corrodes. Within the castle walls, Elizabeth's gaze grew sharper. She began to walk the halls at night, listening to the whispers of her own footsteps. The portraits of her ancestors watched her from the shadows, stern men and ruthless women painted in the armor of centuries. Sometimes she would stop before the portrait of her great-uncle, Stephen Bathory, once king of Poland. His eyes seemed alive, proud, unblinking. She would whisper to him in the dark, "Was cruelty your crown, or your punishment?" Outside, the wars continued. Hungary lay broken between the Habsburg crown and the Ottoman crescent. Armies marched endlessly, consuming villages like fire consumes dry grass. The peasants starved, the nobility schemed. The world had become a battlefield, and in that chaos, Elizabeth found clarity. She began to withdraw from courtly life, preferring the isolation of her fortress. Letters from Vienna went unanswered. Invitations from noble houses remained sealed. She dismissed musicians and jesters, keeping only the servants she trusted absolutely. Anna Darvulia, a woman of peculiar devotion. Ilona Jo, her long-serving chambermaid, and 2 guards whose loyalty was bought not with coin, but with fear. The castle took on the stillness of a tomb. Darvulia, the closest to her, was rumored to know the ways of herbs and spirits, a midwife with the eyes of a crow. She spoke of alchemy, of potions that could preserve beauty, of charms whispered over bowls of blood and milk. Elizabeth listened with fascination, though she pretended disinterest. But when the candles dimmed and the night wind howled, her questions grew darker. How long does youth last? How does one keep flesh from decay? What makes the heart remain young when the body betrays it? Darvulia never gave direct answers. Instead, she showed the Countess things: powders that dulled pain, tinctures that stained the skin pale, perfumes that hid the scent of rot. It was during this time that the disappearances began to multiply. Servants replaced servants. Young peasant girls were brought to the castle, said to be in training for noble service. Some lasted weeks, others days. None were seen again beyond the walls. The excuses were endless: illness, dismissal, runaway girls. The local priest raised questions, but his inquiries were met with gifts, land, and finally silence. To Elizabeth, these girls were not victims but mirrors. Each reflected a version of herself long gone, the laughter of youth, the radiance of skin untouched by years. She watched them with fascination, envy, and a strange tenderness that bordered on hate. Sometimes she would summon one of them to her chambers, study her face in candlelight, touch her hair, ask her questions about love or fear. Then, when the girl trembled, Elizabeth's voice would harden. "Do you think beauty is a gift?" she would murmur. "It is not. It is a debt." The punishments that followed were called lessons. At first, they were confined to slaps, whips, humiliation. But cruelty, once awakened, grows like ivy creeping, twisting, impossible to control. Soon, the lessons became ritual. Blood was spilled. The Countess watched. She claimed it was justice, but her heart knew otherwise. Her attendants began to participate, bound not by loyalty but by fascination and terror. DRACULA guided her hand, whispering that the blood of the young carried the essence of life itself. Elizabeth's mind, once sharp with reason, began to blur with obsession. One night, as the moon hung like a blade above Csejte, she walked into the bathhouse alone. The room was filled with steam, the air heavy with iron and roses. In the center stood a marble basin, streaked with crimson. She removed her gloves and touched the surface. Warm, silken, she stared at her reflection rippling in the blood. The lines of age around her eyes seemed to fade beneath the red glow. Whether it was illusion or miracle, she did not care. In that moment, she believed she had found her answer. Outside, snow blanketed the hills. The villagers whispered that the castle no longer slept. At night, they saw torches flickering in upper windows, heard muffled cries carried by the wind. The local magistrate sent word to the capital, but the messenger never returned. Years passed. Elizabeth aged, but slowly, too slowly, some said. Her beauty remained unnatural, her eyes gleaming with something that was not quite human. She hosted no more guests, no more banquets. Yet carts still came to the castle gates, carrying young girls in peasant clothes. They were promised wages, service, protection. None were seen again. Within the walls, servants vanished, and new ones appeared. The smell of iron hung in the air. Dogs barked at shadows that moved where no one should be. Elizabeth began to record her own thoughts in a private journal, written in a code only she could read. Scholars who later claimed to have seen fragments said the words were half confession, half theology. "Blood," she wrote, "is not sin. It is the currency of life. God himself demanded it once upon the altar." Her mind had crossed the threshold between belief and delusion, but to her it was revelation. Each act was no longer cruelty, it was purification. Each drop of blood, a prayer. When DRACULA died suddenly, some said poisoned by her own herbs, Elizabeth did not weep. She sealed the room they had worked in and forbade anyone to enter. From that night onward, she acted alone. The rituals became her solace, her obsession, her identity. Power had transformed into sanctity. Fear became worship. And in her eyes, the castle itself had become sacred ground, an altar upon which the old world was reborn in blood. But beyond those walls, rumors had begun to reach the royal court. Peasants whispered of hundreds gone missing. Priests spoke of screams in the night. And the name Bathory, once spoken with reverence, began to carry a tremor of horror. The sun still rose over Csejte, golden and merciless. Yet within its towers, the Countess had already descended into a night from which she would never return. The castle of Csejte stood high above the valley, like a wound in the mountain, its towers gray and ancient, its windows dark as eyes that had forgotten sleep. The villagers below lived in its shadow, measuring time not by the sun, but by the smoke that rose from the chimneys. They said that the Countess no longer walked among the living. To outsiders, the fortress remained a symbol of noble authority. Its banners still bore the crimson dragon of the Bathory line, fluttering against the wind like tongues of flame. Yet within, something unseen had begun to decay. The halls, once bright with music and laughter, had grown silent. Servants whispered instead of speaking. Their eyes followed the Countess as she moved, every gesture measured, Every silence waited. She had become a law unto herself. Judge, priest, executioner. Her mornings began before dawn. In the east tower, she would stand before the window and watch the world awaken beneath her feet. Her handmaidens waited behind her, afraid even to breathe. When she finally turned, her voice was calm and precise. She spoke of order, of discipline, of God's will reflected through human hands. She had convinced herself that she was chosen, that her suffering, her widowhood, her isolation were not curses but purification. Each punishment she gave, she said, restored balance to a world that had lost it. Her eyes, once soft and thoughtful, had hardened into glass. In the courtyard, the cries of servants echoed at night. They were not loud enough to carry beyond the castle walls, but inside, they were constant, a chorus of pain woven into the rhythm of daily life. To the Countess, it was no longer cruelty. It was routine. Her steward, Ujvari, kept a careful ledger. Each name, each infraction, each disappearance was written in neat ink, the pages bound in black leather. Elizabeth inspected the book often. Sometimes, when she saw a name crossed out, she smiled faintly, not out of satisfaction, but out of control. There was an order to it, she told herself. Everything had its place, even terror. At the heart of the castle lay her private chambers, a labyrinth of stone corridors leading to rooms the servants called the Red Hall. Few entered. Those who did never spoke again. Candles burned there day and night, their wax forming towers of melted white around the altar at the center. The smell of herbs and iron filled the air. Bottles lined the walls, strange mixtures of wine, oil, and something darker. Elizabeth worked like a scientist, cold and deliberate. She recorded the color of blood under candlelight, the way skin changed after pain, the limits of endurance. To her, it was not madness, but knowledge forbidden. Yes, but divine. Outside, the villages of Trenksen and Bicha began to empty of their daughters. Families whispered that the Countess's servants rode at night, promising wages and food. They returned alone, claiming the girls had found other work. But mothers knew better. They prayed to God, then to the saints, then finally to no one. For God seemed deaf when it came to the castle of Csejte. One winter evening, a merchant from Vienna arrived, seeking payment for cloth. He was welcomed, fed, and shown to a guest room. Late that night, as he walked the corridors, he heard a sound faint, rhythmic like weeping. Following it, he found a door half open, light flickering beyond. He glimpsed shadows, moving figures, bending, lifting, whispering. Then a shape on the floor, pale, motionless. Before he could see more, a guard's hand gripped his shoulder. "This way, sir," the man said quietly. "You've lost your way." The next morning, the merchant was gone. His horse was found at the foot of the hill, riderless, its reins stained with something dark. The rumors reached the clergy again. Father Ponikenush, a local pastor known for his courage, wrote to the Countess, begging her to show mercy, to remember the fear of God. She replied in her elegant script, "God does not fear the instruments of his will. He created kings to rule and nobles to discipline. You mistake mercy for weakness." The priest read her words aloud to his congregation, and his voice shook. That night, his chapel was found desecrated. On the altar, a dead lamb lay slit open, its blood forming the shape of a crown. In the castle, Elizabeth's health began to change. Her skin grew paler, almost luminous. Some said she used strange baths and tinctures. Others whispered she no longer ate, that she fed only on the smell of blood itself. Whatever the truth, her presence had become unbearable. Even her closest attendants trembled when she entered the room. One servant, a girl named Katerina, tried to flee. She was caught at the gate, barefoot in the snow. They brought her before the Countess, who asked only one question: "Why run from grace?" The girl's answer was lost to time. Her screams were not. Afterward, Elizabeth ordered a fast. For 3 days, no one in the castle was allowed to eat or speak. The silence was so complete that even the crows abandoned the towers. It was during this silence that she began to write her second journal, the one historians still debate today. In it, she described her acts not as murders but as sacraments. Blood, she wrote, is memory. Through it, I preserve the youth they waste. To her, every life taken was not destruction but transformation. The castle had become her temple, she its high priestess. By the 3rd year of her widowhood, she rarely left the walls of Csejte. The seasons passed unnoticed. Her reflection in the mirror seemed unchanged, and she took it as proof that her rituals worked. Vanity and faith became indistinguishable. But beyond her fortress, the kingdom whispered her name with horror. Servants fled, priests muttered heresy under their breath, and local officials began to take notice. The Countess did not care. In her mind, she was beyond judgment, beyond mortality. Her ancestors ruled with sword and fire. She ruled with something purer, the essence of life itself. At night she walked the corridors, barefoot, her gown whispering against the stone. Behind her trailed the faint scent of roses and death. The moonlight touched her face, and for a moment she looked not monstrous but divine, like a saint sculpted from marble and madness. No one in Csejte dared to meet her eyes. And still, the screams continued. Snow blanketed the valley like a shroud. Csejte Castle loomed above the frost, its towers clawing at a sky the color of iron. Winter had silenced everything, the rivers, the roads, even the birds. But within the castle walls, the silence was different. It was not peace, it was fear. The servants had learned to move like shadows, their eyes hollow, their bodies lean. They obeyed without question. They whispered prayers not to God, but to the stones themselves, as if the walls might take pity. Elizabeth's presence had become unbearable. Her beauty, once luminous, now glowed with an unnatural sheen. Her lips, too red, her skin, too smooth. When she smiled, her teeth seemed to gleam in the candlelight. She rarely slept. Those who saw her at dawn said she wandered the halls barefoot, muttering verses to herself. All flesh withers, she murmured once to her maid Ilona, but blood remembers. Outside, rumors thickened like smoke. Travelers spoke of screams that echoed across the hills at night, of young girls who vanished after visiting the Countess, of servants who burned their own tongues rather than speak of what they'd seen. By spring, word had reached the regional magistrate, a cautious man named Istvan Benichki. He had known the Bathory name all his life. To accuse one of them, even in whispers, was dangerous. But when mothers began to appear at his doorstep, eyes swollen from weeping, clutching scraps of fabric and locks of hair, he could no longer ignore them. He sent 2 of his men to Csejte under the guise of tax collectors. They returned pale and silent. One of them quit his post the next day. The other took ill and died before summer. The Countess continued her charity, inviting peasant girls to the castle for work and education. She called it mercy. The villagers called it harvest. Each arrival followed the same pattern. A cart approaching the gate at dusk, a handmaiden greeting them with false warmth, the heavy clang of the portcullis closing behind them. Then nothing. Only smoke from the chimneys and silence from the hills. In her private chambers, Elizabeth kept a book of names, hundreds of them, written in her careful, elegant script. Each name was followed by a mark, a cross, a symbol, sometimes a word. Pure, defiant, broken. Historians would later claim it was an inventory of victims. To her, it was a record of devotion. One evening, as thunder rolled across the mountains, she sat by candlelight writing in that same ledger. Her hand did not tremble. The candle flame flickered, and her face seemed carved from marble. She paused, dipped her quill, and whispered to no one, "Their fear keeps me alive." Then she smiled, as if at a memory. Her attendants, Ilona and Dorothea, began to take part more openly. What had once been obedience had become belief. They served her as acolytes, dressing her in white linen before her ceremonies, preparing the chamber with bowls of water and crushed herbs. To them, the Countess was not cruel, she was divine. The blood they spilled was sacrifice, not sin. But outside those walls, the truth had begun to grow teeth. In Vienna, whispers reached the Habsburg court. The emperor himself had heard of a noblewoman who bathes in blood. Some laughed, calling it superstition. Others saw danger. The Bathory family's power was immense, but scandal could destroy even a dynasty. Letters began to circulate, cautious at first, then urgent. Count György Terzo, Palatine of Hungary and trusted ally of the king, received one such letter late in 1610. It was brief and unsigned. If the Countess Bathory is not stopped, the land itself will turn red. Terzo had known Elizabeth's husband. He had fought beside Ferenc Nadasdy years ago, had shared wine and blood and victory. He owed the Bathory's respect, but loyalty, in those days, was currency, and scandal could bankrupt it. He began a quiet inquiry. He sent riders to villages around Csejte, disguised as traders, to ask questions. They returned with the same stories: girls missing, families silenced, strange lights in the castle at night. The details differed, but the fear was constant. In one account, a shepherd spoke of finding bones near a stream below the castle, small, white, gnawed clean. In another, a gravedigger claimed he'd been paid in gold to bury servants who had never served. Terzo read the reports in silence, the firelight trembling across his face. He said only, "There are things one cannot ignore, even among the highborn." At Csejte, Elizabeth felt the shift. She sensed the air thickening with suspicion, the way animals feel storms before the sky darkens. But she dismissed it. She believed herself untouchable. The king might rule by sword and coin, but she ruled by fear, and fear, she thought, was eternal. Her obsession deepened. She began experimenting with mixtures of milk, honey, and blood, claiming they made her skin as smooth as innocence. Her attendants no longer questioned her. They had become reflections of her will. The rituals grew bolder, more theatrical. She would stand in her chamber surrounded by candles, her white gown turning crimson as she prayed aloud. Her voice was steady, almost serene. "The body is a vessel," she said, "and I am its keeper." Outside, thunder broke over the valley again, rolling like drums of war. By the autumn of 1610, more than 200 names filled her book. Servants had begun to vanish entirely. The peasants stopped sending their daughters, even under threat. The castle grew emptier, its silence suffocating. Then one night, a young noblewoman disappeared, not a peasant girl, but the daughter of a minor baron, sent to learn etiquette under the countess's care. Her family demanded answers. Elizabeth replied that the girl had fallen ill and been sent home, but no carriage had arrived. No letters followed. That disappearance changed everything. For the first time, the blood of nobility was involved. Terzo received permission from the king to act quietly, swiftly, and without scandal. He would ride to Csejte with soldiers, under the pretext of inspection. Inside the castle, Elizabeth continued as though nothing had changed. Her reflections still pleased her. Her journals still filled with scripture twisted into devotion. She believed her empire eternal. But even the most fortified walls cannot silence the sound of truth forever. The first crack appeared not in stone, but in loyalty. One of her guards, Torok, confessed to a priest. His voice shook as he spoke of the chambers, of the screams, of the pale hands that no longer moved. The priest recorded his confession and sealed it with wax. Within a week, the paper was in Terzo's hands. Snow began to fall again. The countess lit her candles that night as usual, unaware that her final winter had begun. The snow fell thick and soundless that winter, muffling the world beneath a white, endless weight. Inside the castle of Csejte, time no longer passed in seasons but in rituals. Candles replaced sunlight. Shadows replaced sleep. Elizabeth Bathory sat before her mirror, the glass dim with age, her reflection wavering in the flicker of firelight. Her hair, once dark as ink, shimmered now with strands of silver. She touched them gently, as though they were wounds. Beauty had been her inheritance, her weapon, her armor. Now it betrayed her. Each morning the mirror revealed another fracture, another sign that even she could not defy time. Outside her chamber, servants waited in fear. The countess's moods had become unpredictable, her punishments more sudden, her gaze more hollow. When she called, they came trembling, unsure whether they would serve or suffer. That morning, it was a young maid barely 16 who entered with a basin of water and a comb. Her name was Kata. She had been brought to the castle only weeks before, and already she had learned silence. Her hand shook as she approached the countess, bowing her head. Elizabeth said nothing. She sat still as the girl began to brush her hair, each stroke careful and slow. The silence stretched thin, the only sound the soft crackle of fire and the whisper of the comb through hair. Then, it happened. A single tug, too harsh, too clumsy. A sharp strand pulled from the countess's scalp. Elizabeth's breath caught. The girl stammered an apology, her voice trembling. But the countess's hand struck before thought could stop at a swift, brutal blow. Kata fell backward, the comb clattering to the floor. Blood spilled from her nose, splashing across the countess's hand. For an instant, both froze. Elizabeth looked down at the crimson drops glistening on her skin. The firelight caught them, turning them to jewels. She raised her hand, mesmerized. The warmth, the color, it seemed alive. The girl sobbed softly. Elizabeth ignored her. Her eyes were fixed on the smear of blood across her fingers. Slowly, she wiped it against her other hand, tracing the red line across her skin. And then, something strange. Under the flickering light, the skin seemed brighter, smoother, younger. It was illusion, perhaps the play of shadow and flame. But to Elizabeth, it was revelation. She rose from her chair, her breath unsteady, her eyes wide, as if seeing for the first time. "Leave," she whispered. The girl fled, clutching her face, her sobs echoing down the hall. Elizabeth remained before the mirror, staring at her reflection. Her lips parted in awe, her pulse quickened. The thought came not as madness, but as logic, cold, perfect logic. If youth faded from the body, then perhaps it could be restored through the essence of life itself. If blood was life, then blood could heal. That night, she did not sleep. She walked the corridors of Csejte like a spirit, her bare feet whispering across the stone. Servants avoided her gaze. The torches along the walls flickered in her wake, as though shrinking from her. When dawn came, she summoned her most trusted handmaid, Ilona Jo, and her confidant, Dorothea Sentes. She told them what had happened, the accident, the blood, the change she believed she had seen. Ilona hesitated, crossing herself. Dorothea only listened, her eyes gleaming with fascination. "If it is true," she said softly, "then perhaps the Lord has chosen you." Elizabeth smiled. The words felt like prophecy. That evening, she ordered the young maid to return. No one saw her again after that. From then on, the rituals began slow at first. Hidden behind locked doors, Elizabeth demanded privacy, forbidding entry to her chambers during certain hours. Servants whispered of strange sounds, the splash of water, the muffled cries of girls, the scraping of basins dragged across stone. The countess began to wear gloves, always spotless white. Her skin seemed luminous again, her eyes brighter. The villagers spoke of how she looked no older than 30, though she was past 40 by then. Word spread among her attendants that she had discovered a cure for time. Some believed, others trembled. In her private journal, she wrote, "I have seen what others call decay, and I have undone it. The secret lies not in prayer, but in the flesh. In pain, there is purity. In blood, renewal." Soon, she no longer relied on accidents. The rituals became deliberate, precise. She chose her victims carefully, young, healthy, untouched by hardship. She said their vitality was unspoiled. Ilona prepared the chamber. Dorothea fetched the girls. Elizabeth performed the rest. The screams no longer disturbed her. They were merely the sound of transformation. She began to study each process as though conducting an experiment. The temperature of the room, the time of day, the amount of blood, she recorded it all. If the result was imperfect, she adjusted her methods. The line between science and sanctity dissolved. When she looked in the mirror now, her reflection smiled back serene, unblemished, eternal. She felt untouchable. She felt divine. But divinity, once claimed, demands worship. She began to speak of herself as chosen. God made kings to rule the earth, she told her attendants. But he made me to rule the flesh. Her followers knelt, some out of faith, most out of terror. By midsummer, the castle's servants had dwindled again. Those who remained were bound by silence. Outside, the peasants no longer approached. The forests near Csejte grew over the paths, as though nature itself recoiled. And still, she continued, every ritual, every drop of blood reaffirmed her illusion. Each victim was another stone in the monument she built against death. In her chambers, the mirror reflected not a woman but an idea, the belief that beauty could conquer mortality, that cruelty could sanctify power. One night, as the moon rose full above the castle, Elizabeth stood before that mirror, her body draped in white, her skin shining faintly red. Behind her, the candles flickered, their flames bending as though in reverence. She smiled at her reflection, radiant, perfect, eternal. Then, in a whisper that seemed to echo through the halls, she said, "If blood is life, then I shall never die." Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. The world trembled, though she did not yet know why. For even as she crowned herself with eternity, the first cracks of her empire were beginning to show. Would you like me to continue directly with Chapter 4? Part 2 is approximately equal to 1,250 words, where her blood rituals evolve into full-blown myth, her servants become zealots, and the horror inside Csejte becomes impossible to hide. The air inside Csejte grew heavy, as though it too had learned to hold its breath. The castle no longer belonged to the living. It belonged to whispers, to footsteps that stopped at locked doors, to the smell of iron and rosewater mingled into one. Elizabeth Bathory had turned her home into a sanctum, a sanctuary for youth, beauty, and blood. In the upper tower, the walls had been repainted a deep crimson. Curtains of velvet drowned the light. Silver bowls and basins glimmered like relics upon an altar. The servants who entered that chamber never spoke of it again, but all knew what it was for. At night, when the torches guttered low, the Countess would walk barefoot through the halls, her gown trailing like a shadow. Her face glowed pale as the moon. Those who met her eyes felt the weight of centuries in her stare, as if she had already crossed beyond mortality and returned to command it. She no longer needed persuasion. The fear she inspired was enough. DRACULA, the closest of her attendants, became her priestess, preparing the victims, murmuring prayers as if this were divine work. Ilona, ever loyal, guarded the chamber doors, keeping the curious away. They called it the purification. The rituals followed no scripture. They were improvisations born of madness and faith entwined. Sometimes the Countess would speak in a trance, reciting psalms she twisted into something unholy. Other nights she was silent, her hands steady, her eyes distant, as though performing surgery on the human soul. Outside, the peasants whispered that the Lady of Csejte was summoning demons. Inside, Elizabeth whispered that she was summoning youth. To her, the two were no longer different things. One winter evening, a storm raged across the Carpathians, shaking the castle to its core. Within, Elizabeth sat before the fire, her hands stained faintly pink. DRACULA stood beside her, holding a silver goblet. "The priests say beauty is vanity," Elizabeth murmured, her gaze distant. "But what is ugliness then, if not sin punished in flesh?" DRACULA lowered her head. "You are proof that God's favor can be kept," she said. Elizabeth smiled faintly. "Then, I am his vessel." Outside, thunder rolled like judgment. The rituals became more elaborate. Some spoke of mirrors that lined the chamber walls, so she could watch the transformation from every angle. Others told of golden bowls engraved with symbols not of Christianity, but older, pagan sigils whispered from her Carpathian ancestors. When the victim screamed, the walls seemed to tremble. The wind howled through the towers as if echoing their cries. And still, the Countess continued, methodical and calm. She began keeping records not of names, but of effects. The young, she wrote, carry warmth that lasts longer. The older, only bitterness. Her writings grew detached, almost medical. Each entry a reflection of her descent into godhood, through science twisted into superstition. In the quiet hours before dawn, she would read them aloud to herself, her voice low and measured, like prayer. In each life taken, I preserve another. The world consumes itself. I merely guide the process. By now, the rumors had reached far beyond the castle walls. In nearby villages, mothers forbade their daughters from seeking service under the countess. But poverty is patient, and hunger cruel, and Csejte, for all its darkness, still promised coin. One by one, they came, and one by one, they vanished. Elizabeth understood the danger of disappearance, so she adapted. She sent her agents farther, to smaller hamlets, to bring back girls no one would miss. Servants of servants, orphans, the forgotten. Her estate became a network of silence. At the same time, she grew more distant from the world of nobles and courts. Invitations went unanswered, letters unopened. Her estate became her universe, and she, its axis. She told herself she was not killing. She was refining, perfecting. Her acts were not cruelty but craft. Yet sometimes, in the hours after a ritual, she would collapse beside the basin, trembling, whispering her own name as if to remind herself she was still human. The mirror offered no comfort. The reflection that stared back was flawless, too flawless, ageless, soulless. She began to fear sleep. In dreams, she saw faces, hundreds of them staring, mouths open but silent, eyes wide with accusation. She woke drenched in sweat, clutching her throat, gasping for air that seemed suddenly thin. But by morning, her resolve returned. She blamed the dreams on weakness, on doubt. She could not afford doubt. It was DRACULA who first suggested using noble-born girls. The peasant's blood fades quickly, she said, her tone clinical. But those of higher stock, their essence is stronger, more refined, like wine aged in oak. Elizabeth hesitated. It would draw attention, she warned, only if the bodies are found. It was a dangerous temptation, and precisely the one she could not resist. Soon, carriages began arriving at night, bringing daughters of minor nobles seeking apprenticeship or patronage. Elizabeth welcomed them with warmth, promising education, refinement, connection. The castle, always ominous, now seemed inviting. The grand hall glittered with gold, the fireplaces roaring. The countess herself received her guests with grace and charm, her voice soft, her manner regal. But when the doors closed, the warmth turned to cold stone. Weeks later, the carriages would depart empty. By 1609, the count of missing girls had become impossible to ignore. The villages murmured of witchcraft, of pagan rites. Some said she bathed in blood to preserve her youth, others that she was possessed by the devil. The truth, as always, was simpler and far more terrifying, she believed. Each act of cruelty was justified by devotion. Every death rationalized by the pursuit of beauty, the one virtue her world had allowed her. To be beautiful was to be powerful. To lose beauty was to lose worth. So she fought against decay, with the only weapon left to her, the suffering of others. One night, she stood again before her mirror, the reflection glowing in the candlelight. Her skin was perfect, her face untouched by time. And yet, for the first time in years, she saw something else a flicker behind her eyes. Not age, not weariness, but emptiness. She reached out to touch the mirror. Her hand trembled. The glass was cold, colder than it should have been. Behind her, the wind moaned through the corridor. Somewhere far below, a door slammed. She turned sharply. Nothing, only silence. For a brief, shattering moment, she wondered if perhaps she had gone too far, if she had not conquered death, but invited it into her home. Then the thought passed. She smiled faintly. "They will never understand," she whispered, "but they will remember." Outside, the first snow of another winter began to fall, soft, white, pure. Inside, the Countess of Blood knelt before her altar and whispered a prayer only she could understand. It was not for forgiveness. It was for eternity. This is the point where the legend of the Blood Countess extends beyond the walls of Csejte. Fear becomes her true kingdom, and the silence that sustains her begins to crack. The forests around Csejte were silent that spring. Birds no longer nested near the castle walls. The villagers said the trees themselves leaned away, their branches twisting as if to avoid her gaze. From the high towers, the Countess of Blood watched the land that still bent to her will. Fields, forests, hamlets, all part of her inheritance. But her dominion was no longer over earth or coin. It was over fear. Fear had become her language, her law, her faith. Within the walls, obedience was absolute. Every servant knew their place. Every whisper carried weight. Even those who helped her, Ilona, Dracula, and the young steward Janos Ujvari, walked lightly, as though the stones themselves listened. They had become extensions of her will. The rituals were no longer hidden in one chamber. They spread into the cellars, the old storerooms, the bathhouse. The smell of iron seeped into the mortar. Every torch burned longer, every corridor darker. At the heart of it all was Elizabeth, serene as ever, as if she presided over a court of shadows. She still wore silk, still spoke softly, still moved with the grace of nobility. But her eyes had changed. They no longer saw people, only instruments. She had refined cruelty into art. By day, she ruled her estate with precision. Records of crops, taxes, and rents were meticulously kept. Her letters to other nobles were elegant, persuasive, untouched by madness. She entertained guests when she had to, masking her obsessions behind the smile of a cultured widow. No one dared to question her solitude, her secrecy. She was a Bathory, a name older than the throne itself. At night, the mask slipped. Servants who failed in their duties vanished. The few who escaped described the sound of laughter echoing from below, not the laughter of joy, but of something cold, hollow, triumphant. Ilona, who had once flinched at the sight of blood, now moved with practiced calm. Dracula whispered hymns during the rituals, convinced they were performing divine purification. They were not captives, they were believers. And Elizabeth, she was their priestess, their goddess, and their fear. Outside the castle walls, rumors began to take shape. Villagers spoke of lights at night, red and flickering, like torches carried through the tower windows. They spoke of strange smoke drifting from the chimneys even when no fires burned. Once, a shepherd claimed to have found the remains of a young woman near the stream below the hill, pale skin, hair golden as wheat, hands clasped as if in prayer. By morning, the body was gone. When he told the story at the tavern, he found himself surrounded by silence. No one asked questions. No one wanted answers. In Hungary, the Bathory name was law. To accuse her was to accuse the bloodline that had defended the kingdom from the Ottomans, that had furnished kings and warriors. It was unthinkable. And yet, the whispers grew louder. In one of her letters, written in her delicate hand, Elizabeth lamented the decay of the world. Virtue fades like the flesh. Only those with courage preserve what time would destroy. To her, cruelty was no longer sin, but necessity, the discipline of the chosen. Every act of violence reinforced her conviction that she was beyond mortal judgment. She began to dream of a new order, a world remade in her image, where beauty was law and weakness a crime. God punishes imperfection, she once told Ilona as she prepared the chamber. I merely assist his will. Ilona nodded, eyes blank, hands steady. The line between loyalty and corruption had long been erased. The peasants of the region began to live in constant dread. They avoided the castle road even by day. At night, they bolted their doors and whispered prayers to saints whose names they could barely remember. Children were warned not to wander near the forest. Travelers who lost their way rarely returned. The silence of the countryside became the Countess's greatest weapon. Fear silenced rebellion. Fear protected her. When the local magistrate received reports of disappearances, He folded them neatly and sent them to her steward, who, of course, ensured they never reached Buda. It was not just her cruelty that sustained her empire. It was her power. She was untouchable, noble, wealthy, connected to families that commanded armies. The crown itself owed the Bathory's debt. And so, for years, the blood continued to flow, and the kingdom looked away. But even empires built on terror have cracks. The first came from within. One of the chambermaids, a girl named Susanna, fled the castle one stormy night, barefoot and half-mad. She reached the nearest village by dawn, her hands torn, her face pale as frost. She spoke of screams, of basins filled with blood, of the countess bathing in it as her servants watched in reverence. The villagers called her possessed, delirious, but a priest took her confession and wrote every word. Weeks later, Susanna was found dead near the woods. Some said wolves, others said silence, but the priest kept her story. Inside the castle, Elizabeth grew more restless. Each ritual brought diminishing satisfaction. The results, her reflection, no longer filled her with triumph but with unease. Was she truly preserved, or merely painted in the blood of her victims? She began ordering more frequent rituals, as though chasing a fading miracle. Her attendants followed blindly, even as their own faces grew haunted. Dorothea's faith hardened into fanaticism. She began to speak of Elizabeth as a saint, Saint Elizabeth of the Scarlet Veil. Ilona's hands trembled when she washed the marble floors. She had stopped sleeping. Some nights she claimed to hear voices whispering from the drains, calling her name. Janos, the steward, drank heavily. Once, he stumbled upon Elizabeth in the corridor, her gown soaked red, her eyes wild. She looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. "Do you envy me, Janos?" she asked softly. He fell to his knees. "No, my lady." "Good," she whispered. "Envy is for mortals." Then she passed him by, leaving footprints the color of rust on the stone. By the winter of 1610, her fortress had become a mausoleum of silence. No laughter, no song. Only the faint hum of wind through empty corridors, and the occasional scream swallowed by the walls. The countess had created her paradise, but even paradise can rot from within. Because fear, once born, cannot be contained. It spreads from servant to servant, from village to court, until it reaches those who cannot ignore it. And in that final winter, whispers reached the ears of a man who could not look away. Count György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, the king's own representative. He had heard of the vanishing girls, the silence of the villages, the strange light above Csejte. He did not yet believe the stories, but he would, for soon the door to Elizabeth's empire of fear would be forced open, and what waited inside would change the course of Hungarian history forever. The winter of 1610 deepened, and with it, the silence around Csejte became unbearable. Even the crows had abandoned the battlements. Only the wind remained, whistling through the arrow slits like a dirge for a dying world. Inside, Elizabeth Bathory's rule endured not through love or loyalty, but through terror so vast it became routine. Her servants no longer spoke of escape. They moved as ghosts, efficient and wordless. Their faces bore the look of those who had long ceased to believe in dawn. The countess herself had grown thinner, paler, her beauty almost spectral. Yet to her mind, she was eternal, preserved by the grace she believed flowed through her veins, and through the blood she spilled. She had become an empire unto herself, a sovereign of silence and sin. The rituals continued, though less frequently successful. The girls brought to her chambers were younger, weaker. The blood no longer seemed as potent. Elizabeth would pace for hours afterward, staring at her hands as if searching for the flaw in the divine formula. "Faith requires precision," she muttered to Ilona one night, her voice taut. "If the ritual falters, it is because their devotion fails. Purity must be absolute." Ilona nodded, her eyes hollow. She no longer believed, but belief was irrelevant. Fear was obedience enough. Dorothea, meanwhile, had crossed into zealotry. She began keeping her own scrolls of scripture, twisting verses from the Book of Psalms into chants for the rituals. "He who cleanses with pain shall be reborn in light," she would whisper, eyes shining. The Countess encouraged it. Religion, she realized, could sanctify anything, even horror. But outside the castle, faith had begun to shift. In nearby Trencsén and Bicha, parish priests began to share rumors during confession. They spoke of young women disappearing by the dozens, of parents who came to Csejte, begging for word of their daughters and never returned. The rumors reached the ears of Count György Thurzó, Palatine of Hungary, a man of reason and of power. He dismissed the first reports as peasant hysteria. The Bathory name, after all, commanded respect and fear in equal measure. But the letters did not stop. When 3 separate priests, in 3 different parishes, spoke of the same horrors, the same castle, the same noblewoman, Thurzó's skepticism began to waver. He ordered a discreet inquiry. By that time, even within Csejte, cracks had begun to appear. János Udvari, the steward, could no longer bear the sight of what happened each night. The cries haunted him. The smell of burning candles and blood followed him even in dreams. He began to drink more heavily, his guilt fermenting into defiance. One night, after a ritual, he found Elizabeth standing before the great hearth, her gown stained dark. She looked at him, eyes distant, and said, "You tremble, János. Why?" "I am cold, my lady." "Then you have not yet learned. Cold is the price of eternity." She turned away, her shadow flickering in the firelight. He wanted to speak to beg her to stop, but the words would not come. That night, he made his decision. He would write to the Palatine himself. Weeks later, a letter sealed in black wax found its way to Thurzó's private desk. It bore no name, only the mark of a steward, the servant's sign of loyalty and desperation intertwined. The letter was short, written in trembling ink. "Your Excellency, within the walls of Csejte, evil has taken root. The Lady Elizabeth commits acts that defy both God and nature. Do not trust her title. Come yourself if you seek truth. Bring light into her darkness." Thurzó read the letter 3 times before setting it down. He summoned his advisor Benedek and said only, "We ride for Csejte at the year's end." Back at the castle, Elizabeth felt the shifting tide, though no word had reached her yet. Her dreams had grown more violent. She saw her victims standing in rows, faces blank, their mouths open in voiceless prayer. In one dream, she saw herself lying among them, pale, eyes open, blood pooling beneath her like a crimson crown. When she awoke, she ordered the chapel sealed. "God watches too closely," she whispered. Ilona hesitated. "My lady, without prayer." "Prayer is for those who fear judgment," Elizabeth hissed. "I am beyond it." Her attendants obeyed, but their eyes lingered on her longer now, not with devotion, but with dread. One night, a carriage approached the castle gates, a noblewoman and her daughter seeking service. Elizabeth greeted them herself, dressed in black silk, her voice smooth as glass. The girl was 17, beautiful, bright. The Countess smiled. "You will serve well." That night, the girl vanished, but her mother did not leave. She searched the halls, calling her daughter's name until a guard silenced her with a blade. By dawn, word had spread to the nearby town that even noble blood was not safe in Csejte. That was the final thread. The whispers that had stayed in the shadows began to crawl into daylight. In the cold halls of Bicha, Thurzó prepared quietly. He could not accuse Elizabeth outright. She was still kin to kings, godmother to noble children. So he gathered testimonies in secret. Peasants, priests, escaped servants, their stories different in detail but identical in horror. One said she had seen the Countess bite the flesh from a servant's shoulder. Another claimed to have carried barrels of blood from the lower chambers. A third spoke of pits filled with bones beneath the bathhouse. Thurzó listened in silence, his expression carved from stone. When they finished, he said, "If even one of these things is true, she has damned her house beyond redemption." He ordered his men to prepare for a winter journey. Back in Csejte, the castle seemed to sense its own decay. Doors creaked open at night. Candles sputtered out for no reason. The servants walked the corridors in pairs, muttering prayers under their breath. Elizabeth, ever watchful, noticed. "The air is changing," she murmured. "Even the walls betray me." Dracula tried to reassure her. "They fear your greatness, my lady. They fear what they cannot understand." But Ilona, standing behind them, whispered so softly that only the fire heard her. "No, they fear what they do understand." That night, snow began to fall again, heavy, relentless, like the slow descent of judgment. In the distance, the sound of hooves echoed faintly across the frozen fields. The hunters were coming. Winter, 1610. The hills of Upper Hungary lay buried beneath ice. The trees bowed like penitents before a silent god. Snow drifted through the air like ash from an unseen pyre. In the villages surrounding Csejte, fear had become a second language. People no longer spoke the countess's name after sunset. Mothers pulled their daughters inside before dusk, and no candle was left unguarded. Still, every week, someone vanished. A girl sent to the castle to serve. A seamstress who had once worked in the great hall. A washerwoman summoned for the countess's linens and never seen again. The castle gates closed, and the silence swallowed them whole. But fear, like rot, spreads best in silence. By the turn of the year, even the priests could no longer ignore the disappearances. Father Martin of Bitcha was the first to break the chain of silence. He had heard confession after confession of grieving mothers, of brothers and fathers who spoke of lost daughters and unanswered letters. He wrote directly to Count Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, his ink trembling with urgency. "My lord, something unholy dwells in Csejte. The Lady Elizabeth, though noble by birth, walks in darkness. I beg you, for the sake of the kingdom and of God, investigate before the innocent are lost beyond counting." Thurzo read the letter by candlelight, the flame reflected in his weary eyes. He had already heard similar tales from the steward Janos and from priests farther west. This was no longer rumor, it was a pattern. He closed the letter and said to his captain, "Prepare 12 men. No banners, no heraldry. We ride under God's silence." Meanwhile, within Csejte's walls, Elizabeth's world grew increasingly claustrophobic. The countess had begun keeping her windows shuttered even by day. Her skin, once radiant, had taken on a pallid translucence, like marble veined with blue. She refused to eat. Taking instead to strange elixirs, her servants prepared mixtures of herbs, iron, and powdered bone. She believed they kept her spirit sharp. Ilona begged her to rest. "You've not slept, my lady, in 3 nights." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "Sleep is the privilege of the weak. I have outlasted kings." Then she stood, gazing into the mirror, and for a moment, Ilona thought she saw something flicker behind her mistress's reflection. Not the proud noblewoman of Csejte, but a hollow, feverish creature who had forgotten what it meant to be human. In those same days, the countess's supply of new servants dwindled. Families had stopped sending their daughters. Fear had dried the veins that once fed her hunger. Dracula suggested taking girls from farther villages, across the border where her name held less weight. Elizabeth agreed. "Bring me those who do not yet know to fear me." But even this plan faltered. The roads were buried in snow. The peasants whispered of curses that followed her messengers. The Blood Countess was running out of blood. On a frozen January morning, the first real witness escaped. Her name was Catalin Bene, a young servant girl barely 16. She had been brought to the castle in autumn, promised fine clothes and service to the noble house. Within weeks, she had seen more death than a soldier in battle. She fled during a snowstorm, barefoot, her dress torn and stained. She ran until her feet bled through the frost, until the castle's spires vanished behind the white hills. When she reached the nearest village, she collapsed at the steps of the church. Between gasps, she spoke the unspeakable. "They hang girls from hooks, drain them, for beauty. The countess drinks, she bathes, she laughs." Father Martin carried her inside, wrapped her in blankets, and listened as she described the chamber of horrors, the iron cage, the chair with blades, the vats of blood. When she finished, he crossed himself 3 times and whispered, "God have mercy on us all." Within 2 days, the news reached Thurzo's camp. Thurzo now had testimony, living, breathing proof. He summoned his officers. Around the fire, their faces were drawn, shadows dancing on steel. "This is not a trial for a peasant," he said quietly. "This is a reckoning with nobility itself. We tread on dangerous ground." "Will the king sanction the investigation?" asked one. Thurzo shook his head. "Not yet. If we are wrong, we hang for treason. If we are right," he looked into the flames, "then Hungary itself will weep." He decided they would proceed in secret. No announcement, no royal decree. At the year's end, when the revelries of Christmas hid their movement, they would strike. Back in Csejte, paranoia had become Elizabeth's closest companion. She began suspecting her servants of betrayal. One night, she caught János whispering with Ilona near the kitchens and had him beaten nearly to death. When he crawled back to his chamber, he whispered through broken teeth, "She knows. She knows we've spoken." But Ilona, too, had grown weary. Each night she prayed silently, not for her mistress, but for her own soul. Dorothea, on the other hand, grew more fervent. "Let them come," she hissed. "Let the fools and their crosses burn. The Countess is immortal." Elizabeth smiled at that, though the smile did not reach her eyes. "Immortal," she repeated softly. "Yes, let them see what eternity looks like." The snow continued for weeks. The castle became a tomb of whispers. Each corridor held echoes of screams long past. The servants, reduced to a handful, worked under the weight of ghosts. Sometimes they swore they saw movement in the mirrors, pale figures, bleeding, reaching out. Even Elizabeth began to hear them. At night, she would wake and sit upright in bed, listening to footsteps in the hall. But when she opened the door, only silence waited. In her journal, the last pages ever written in her hand, she wrote, "The dead no longer sleep. They gather around my chamber as if awaiting a verdict. Perhaps they think I am their judge. But if I am, who then shall judge me?" On the night of the 29th of December 1610, the Countess prepared for another ritual. Dorothea lit the candles. Ilona carried the final girl, a servant taken from a distant farm, trembling in terror. Elizabeth, draped in crimson, raised her blade. But before she could begin, a sound split the air, iron, striking iron, the unmistakable crash of gates breaking. Then voices, shouts, "By order of the Palatine of Hungary, open in the king's name." For the first time in years, fear crossed Elizabeth's face. Ilona froze. Dorothea screamed. And beyond the chamber door, heavy boots echoed down the corridor like the march of divine retribution. Thus ended the age of silence. Csejte Castle, fortress of blood and vanity, was no longer hidden. The hunters had arrived. The night the soldiers came to Csejte Castle, the sky was a frozen bruise, violet clouds pressing low, the wind carrying the promise of judgment. Count György Thurzo rode at the head of 12 men, cloaked in silence. Their torches shuddered until the last ridge fell behind them. They reached the castle near midnight. The gatekeeper did not expect visitors. When the soldiers demanded entrance, he hesitated. "The lady is at rest," he stammered. Thurzo raised his hand. "Then let her rest under the light of God." With that, the soldiers pushed forward, iron meeting iron, and the gate broke inward with a roar that echoed across the valley. Inside, the great hall was dark, save for a few flickering candles. The air smelled of wax, mold, and something else. Something thick and metallic. Blood. Elizabeth was waiting at the top of the staircase. She did not run. She did not scream. Dressed in black velvet embroidered with silver threads, she looked almost serene, like a widow attending her own funeral. "Lord Thurzo," she said calmly, her voice low but steady, "to what do I owe this intrusion?" "By order of His Majesty," Thurzo replied. "We investigate claims of murder and witchcraft within these walls." She tilted her head slightly, the corners of her mouth curving into a faint smile. "Murder and witchcraft?" You disappoint me. At least accuse me of something original. Thurzo did not answer. He nodded to his men. Search every chamber. The soldiers moved through the corridors like shadows, their boots striking cold stone. They opened doors that had not been opened in years. In one room, they found a table covered with instruments of torture pliers, blades, branding irons, all crusted with dried blood. In another, they discovered a girl, still alive but barely breathing, chained to the wall. Her eyes fluttered open as the torchlight touched her face. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking. "No more." The men froze, one of them wretched. Thurzo stepped forward and placed his cloak around the girl's shoulders. "You are safe now, child." But even as he spoke, he knew she might not survive the night. Down in the cellar, beneath the kitchens, the soldiers found the rest. Barrels half filled with water gone black. Wooden racks stained dark. A pit shallow, hastily covered with straw where limbs jutted through like roots of a poisoned tree. There were too many to count. One soldier crossed himself and whispered, "This is hell." Another said quietly, "No, hell envies this." When Thurzo descended into the chamber, his torch wavered in his grip. He had seen war, plague, executions, but nothing like this. On the far wall hung a mirror, cracked down the center, and before it, a silver basin still glistened wet. He stared at his reflection, split by the glass, and muttered, "God forgive us for what we have allowed." Elizabeth followed them, step by step, as they searched. Her composure never broke. When they reached the cellar, she stood at the threshold, torchlight painting her face in amber and shadow. "Are you satisfied now?" she asked. Thurzo turned to her. "How many?" he demanded. "How many girls have you murdered?" She looked at him not with fear, but pity. "Murdered?" she said softly. "You call it murder to cleanse impurity? You call it murder to preserve what God himself gifted?" Her eyes gleamed. "They gave me their youth, willingly, if not wisely." "Enough!" Thurzo thundered. "By the authority of the king, you are under arrest." She laughed, a low, hollow sound that filled the room. "Arrest me? Do you know who I am? I am Bathory of Exit. My blood rules this land." "Your blood," Thurzo said coldly, "has cursed it." He motioned to his men. "Take her." But even as they seized her, the Countess did not struggle. "Tell the king," she whispered, "that he has condemned his own reflection. You cannot destroy what you fear." As they bound her wrists, she turned her gaze to the wall where the mirror hung. Her reflection seemed to flicker young for an instant, then old, then young again, as if time itself mocked her vanity. "Look closely," she murmured to no one in particular. "Beauty is eternal. You may bury me, but the world will never forget my face." By dawn, the soldiers had scoured the castle. They counted 36 bodies, though some accounts would later claim more than 600. The survivors, a handful of half-mad girls, were taken to nearby villages. Their testimonies would become legends, some true, some exaggerated by horror. Elizabeth was confined to her own chamber, under guard. Thurzo ordered that no one was to enter or leave without his word. As the soldiers sealed the doors, one whispered, "Do you think she's human?" Thurzo paused, looking back toward the locked room. "I think," he said quietly, "she reminds us what humans are capable of." That night, as snow fell over Csejte, the castle seemed to exhale centuries of dread released into the cold. Inside her chamber, Elizabeth sat alone. For the first time in years, she heard the silence, not the muffled sobs of victims, not the whispers of servants, only the sound of her own breath echoing against the walls. She pressed her fingers to the stone where the mortar was still damp. "So this is my tomb," she murmured. Outside, Thurzo stood by the gates, staring at the horizon. The sun had not yet risen, but the clouds were beginning to pale the faintest suggestion of dawn. He turned to his captain. "History will call her a monster, but it will not call us innocent." Then he mounted his horse. "Ride to Pressburg. The king must hear what we have seen." As the soldiers rode away, the castle loomed behind them like a sleeping giant, its towers dark against the snow, Inside, the Countess closed her eyes. For the first time, she did not dream of youth or beauty, only of the blood that had once warmed her hands, now frozen forever in memory. And as the wind howled through the empty halls, it seemed to carry her whisper still. They think they have ended me, but death is only another mirror. The walls of Csejte have been breached. Now the courtroom of history begins to close around her. The storm over Csejte did not end with the breaking of its gates. It merely changed form. Outside, snow fell. Inside, silence froze everything it touched. 3 days after her arrest, Countess Elizabeth Bathory was confined to her upper chamber, a prison of her own wealth. Guards stood at her door, torches burning day and night, though none dared to meet her eyes. They called her the Lady in Black now. The title Countess had already begun to die on their tongues. When György Thurzo returned to the castle on the third evening, he found her standing by the single window that had not been sealed. She was watching the snowfall, her hands resting on the sill as though it were the edge of eternity. "You have visitors," he said. She did not turn. "I have no friends left to visit me." "These are not friends." Thurzo motioned, and 2 guards brought forward a small group, Ilona Jo, Dorothea Sentes, and the old servant Janos Ujvari. Their wrists were bound, their faces pale beneath the torchlight. Elizabeth finally turned. Her eyes fell on them, and for the first time, something flickered in her expression, not guilt, but disbelief. "You?" she said softly. "They would accuse me, and yet it is you who dragged the buckets and the chains?" Dorothea spat at her feet. "We did it for you." "For me?" Elizabeth's voice was calm, almost gentle. "No, Dorothea. You did it because you loved power as I did. Don't pretend virtue now that the candle has gone out." Thurzo raised a hand. "Enough. You will all be taken to Bitcha for interrogation." Ilona cried out, "My lady, tell them the truth. Tell them you made us obey." Elizabeth looked past her, through the window where snow fell like ash. "I told you many things, Ilona," she said quietly, "but obedience was never one of them." The journey to Csejte Castle, where the investigation was to be held, took 2 days through blinding snow. The prisoners were separated, the servants taken to the dungeons, Elizabeth to a guarded tower chamber. Outside in the great hall, Thurzo met with Mate Daniel, a royal notary, and Andras Karisturi, the king's emissary. They spread the letters of accusation across a long oak table, dozens of testimonies from peasants, priests, and servants, some signed in trembling hands, others with marks of the illiterate. Karisturi tapped the pile with a gloved finger. "This will shake the kingdom, György. You understand that?" Thurzo nodded grimly. "If we expose her, the Bathory name falls, and with it, much of the crown's support in the East." "And if we hide her crimes?" Daniel asked. "Then her victims remain buried in silence, and God will judge us instead." There was a long pause. The candles hissed in the cold air. "Then we proceed," Thurzo said finally, but quietly. Elizabeth's interrogation was to be private. When Thurzo entered her chamber the next evening, she was seated by the fire, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her hair unbound. "You look pale, my lord," she said. "Have you slept since your triumph?" Thurzo ignored the provocation. "You are accused of killing more than 80 girls. Your servants have confessed." She smiled faintly. "Confession under torture is merely another kind of poetry, is it not?" He stepped closer. "This is no jest, Elizabeth. There are witnesses, survivors." "Survivors?" she interrupted. "Ah, yes. The ones who fled. They tell stories to make themselves interesting. You know, peasants, they believe lightning is the voice of God. They will believe anything." Thurzo slammed his hand on the table. "Enough deceit. I saw the bodies with my own eyes." For the first time, her mask cracked. Her voice dropped to a whisper, cold as the snow outside. "And did you not feel the same thrill, my lord, standing over them? That secret stirring of power? Do not lie, I saw it in your face." Thurzo recoiled. "You are mad." "Mad?" she echoed. "No, my lord. Merely honest." He turned to leave, his hand trembling on the door. "You will have your trial. Speak your truth there, if you dare." Behind him, her voice followed like smoke. "There is no truth men do not twist to their favor. If the king wishes a monster, I shall wear the mask gladly." In the lower chambers, Ilona, Dorothea, and Janos were being questioned. The interrogations lasted days, punctuated by screams that seeped through the stone walls. Ilona confessed first. Through tears, she described the tortures in detail, the beatings, the burning, the biting. She spoke of how Elizabeth believed the blood of virgins could restore her youth. Dorothea denied everything until the end, cursing the priests and the king alike. When she was finally broken, she shouted one last defiance. We served no devil but her vanity. Their confessions were recorded, signed, and sealed. By the third week of January 1611, the case against the Countess was complete. On January 2nd, a secret tribunal convened at Csejte Castle. The public was not invited. The proceedings were known only to a few nobles and clerics. Thurzo presented his evidence, the testimonies, the physical remains, and the confessions of the servants. The notary read aloud, "The Lady Elizabeth Bathory, by her own hand and command, caused the death of many maidens, subjecting them to torture for her vanity and unnatural pleasures." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. A bishop crossed himself. "How can such wickedness wear the face of nobility?" Thurzo said quietly, "Because wickedness rarely wears its own." When asked to appear before the tribunal, Elizabeth refused. She claimed noble immunity, that no court but the king himself could judge her. The council agreed, reluctantly. The king, anxious to avoid scandal, decreed she would not face public execution. Instead, she was to be confined for life within her castle, her name erased from all titles, her estates divided among her kin. Her accomplices were not so fortunate. Ilona and Dorothea were executed at dawn, burned at the stake. Janos was beheaded before the flames were lit. The crowd that gathered for the execution wept and crossed themselves. But among the murmurs, one phrase lingered. If she were not a noble, her head would burn too. That night, as the fires of justice flickered in the distance, Elizabeth sat once more in her chamber. Thurzo entered for the last time. He found her seated by the window, the moonlight catching in her hair. "It is done," he said. "You will never leave these walls again." She looked up at him, her eyes dark but calm. "Do you believe yourself righteous, Georgi?" "I believe in law. And yet, law bows to kings. Kings bow to fear. And fear," she whispered, "bows only to death." He turned away, unable to meet her gaze. As he reached the door, she called softly, "Tell your king that history remembers women differently than men." Then, with a faint smile, she added, "And sometimes we write it ourselves." The door closed. The lock turned. The Lady of Csejte was alone again, as she had been in the beginning. Outside, the snow fell heavier than ever, covering the earth like a shroud. And beneath that silence, Europe itself seemed to exhale not in peace, but in exhaustion. For every monster burned, another shadow stirred. The winter of 1611 sank its teeth deep into northern Hungary. Snow piled against the battlements of Csejte Castle, sealing the fortress in white silence. No carriages came. No laughter echoed. Only the wind, low and mournful, howled through the frozen stones, like a ghost that could not rest. In a chamber high above the courtyard, Elizabeth Bathory lived, if it could be called living. The door had been bricked shut from the outside, leaving only a narrow slit where food and water were passed each day. The window was reduced to a single opening no larger than a hand, enough to let in a thread of light by day and a ribbon of moon by night. She could not see the sky, only the snow falling endlessly, like ashes of a dying world. At first, she raged. For weeks, the guards could hear her screaming, hurling curses that made even soldiers cross themselves. She shouted Thurzo's name, the king's, and the names of every priest who had dared condemn her. "Do you think stone can hold me?" she cried one night. I am Bathory. Blood remembers its own. The guards ignored her. The one confessed later that sometimes, when she shouted, the torches along the hall seemed to dim. But rage is a fire that consumes itself. By spring, her voice was gone. The screams faded into whispers and the whispers into silence. Deprived of company, Elizabeth turned inward to memory. She replayed her life as one might walk through an abandoned palace, each memory a room, each door leading to another echo. She remembered her childhood in Exeter, the marble halls, the Latin tutors, the cruelty of her uncles. She remembered her wedding, the blood of the hunt on Fering's hands as he placed the ring upon hers. She remembered the laughter of her servants before it all turned to cries. But some memories had edges too sharp to touch. When she tried to recall the first girl she had killed, the first one she had chosen, her mind recoiled. Was it an accident? A punishment gone too far? Or had she known exactly what she was doing from the beginning? No answer came. Only the slow drip of melting snow from the ceiling above. Once, a priest was sent to hear her confession. His name was Father Paul, a young cleric barely 20. He entered her cell trembling, clutching his crucifix like a shield. Elizabeth regarded him with a faint smile. They send children now? To redeem me? He swallowed. I come to bring you peace, my lady. Peace? She murmured. Do you think peace is earned, Father, or bought like silence? He hesitated, then opened his Bible. If you confess, the Lord may forgive even this. Then the Lord must be a generous fool, she said. He began to read anyway, psalms, prayers, words older than the castle itself. She closed her eyes, listening, though he could not tell if she prayed or mocked him. When he finished, she said softly, Tell me, Father, when men kill for God, they are called holy. When women kill for power, they are called witches. Why do you think that is? The priest stammered, Because men are chosen by God to rule. Elizabeth laughed quietly. Then God is easily deceived. The young cleric fled the chamber before dawn. He never returned. By the second year, her beauty had withered. Her hair turned silver. Her hands shook when she tried to write. Still, she kept a diary, scratching words into parchment with the stub of a quill. They call me monster. But what is a monster except what others fear to become? I no longer dream, only remember. And memory is crueler than judgment. Sometimes I think I hear the girls outside the wall. They whisper, but I cannot tell if they forgive me or wait for me. Outside her prison, the legend had already begun. Merchants whispered of the Blood Countess who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. Traveling bards sang songs of her beauty and her wickedness, of her castle where the snow was said to fall red at dawn. The king ordered that her name never be spoken at court. Yet the more they silenced her, the more the story grew. Noblewomen wore pendants shaped like drops of ruby Bathory stones. They called them charms to ward off vanity and sin. In Vienna, pamphlets circulated depicting her as a she-devil with a goblet of blood. In Prague, priests used her name in sermons. Let no woman become another Bathory. She had become what she once desired, immortal. Not in youth, but in infamy. Occasionally, her jailers reported strange happenings. The guards claimed to hear faint singing from her chamber long after midnight, a haunting, wordless melody. Once, a sentry swore he saw her standing at the slit of her window, face illuminated by moonlight, her eyes black as obsidian. He blinked, and she was gone. Others said that when she spoke through the wall to request food, her voice still carried command. Bread, she would say, and wine, the red kind. They began to fear her, as though confinement had not stripped her of power but condensed it. In the third year, a letter arrived from her cousin, Count Georgi Drugeth, who had inherited part of her estate. He wrote in cautious tones, advising her to repent, reminding her of God's mercy. She replied in a shaky hand, Do not pity me, cousin. I have known power more absolute than any crown. They fear me even now, behind these walls. That is not punishment. It is victory. The messenger who delivered the letter claimed that when she sealed it, her hands were trembling not from age, but from fury barely contained. By the summer of 1613, Elizabeth's health began to fail. She refused food for days at a time, speaking only to the guards when absolutely necessary. One night, she called the captain to her door. "You have served me long," she said from behind the wall. "Tell me, do you think I am guilty?" The captain hesitated. "My lady, I think only God can know the hearts of the wicked." She was silent for a long time. Then she said softly, "Then let him come and look." It was the last conversation she would ever have. That autumn, the nights grew longer than ever before. On the morning of the 21st of August, 1614, the guard opened the small hatch to deliver her food. She was lying on her bed, her hands folded over her chest, her eyes open but unseeing. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle, only the faintest trace of a smile, as if she had finally seen something the living could not. They sealed the chamber again, as ordered. No bells were rung, no priest was summoned. The king forbade any monument, any funeral. Her body was buried in secret, somewhere beyond the castle grounds, its exact resting place lost to time. And yet, even after death, the wind around Csejte carried whispers. Travelers claimed to see a pale woman walking the battlements under the moon, her gown trailing blood across the snow. Villagers said the castle lights flickered whenever a young girl disappeared nearby. And in the centuries that followed, her name would become a mirror, reflecting not only her cruelty, but the darkness of those who told her story. For in every generation, there are those who crave beauty, power, and immortality, and who are willing to bleed the world to get them. The trial and the legend. Voices of the accused. The courtroom was not a grand hall, but a cold stone chamber deep within the fortress of Bitche, far from the eyes of the Hungarian nobility. The king had decreed it, so this trial must remain unseen. To expose a countess of the house of Bathory was to expose the rot of an empire. Still, the air outside the fortress crackled with tension. Crowds gathered on the frozen streets, whispering prayers and rumors in equal measure. Some claimed to have seen the victims themselves, pale girls wandering the woods at night, their gowns soaked in blood, their faces hollow as wax. Others said that the devil had built his church within Csejte Castle, and that Elizabeth had been his high priestess. Inside, the tribunal was assembled, Judge Thurzo presiding, priests in black robes lining the walls, and a handful of scribes whose trembling hands would soon carve a legend into ink. At the center of the room stood a wooden chair, empty. Elizabeth Bathory would not be brought before them. The king forbade her presence, not out of mercy, but fear. A woman of her rank, seen in chains, could fracture the fragile hierarchy of the realm. Instead, her servants would speak for her. The first to testify was Dorothea Sentes, known as Dorka, an old woman whose eyes were sharp despite her years. She had served Elizabeth for 2 decades, first as a maid, then as something darker. When asked if she had participated in the tortures, she smiled faintly. "We did what Our Lady commanded," she said. To disobey her was to die. To obey was to live a little longer. The judges pressed her. What did she see? She described the punishments in a voice so calm it chilled the room. Needles driven beneath fingernails, girls hung upside down over basins, the countess standing beside them with her face lit by candlelight. Did she ever bathe in their blood? A priest demanded. Dorka hesitated. "No," she said slowly. "She only touched it, rubbed it into her skin. She said it made her young again." Gasps echoed through the chamber. The scribes' pens scratched furiously. The myth was being born not from imagination, but from the quiet confessions of those who had once knelt before her. Next came Ilona Ho, another servant. Her voice trembled, her body frail from imprisonment. "I carried the girls to her," she whispered. "Some were beggars, some were daughters of lesser nobles, sent to learn courtly manners." "And what happened to them?" "They screamed," Ilona said simply. "And then they were gone." When asked why she had not fled, tears welled in her eyes. "Where could we go?" The countess owned everything, the castle, the land, even the priests, God himself seemed far away. Her words hung in the air like incense, thick with guilt and fear. But not all the testimonies agreed. A soldier, Benedict Deseo, claimed he had seen no corpses, only stories spread by jealous men seeking to ruin a woman's name. She ruled with iron, he said, and men hate nothing more than a woman they cannot control. The court dismissed him quickly. Truth had already chosen its shape. The scribes were not writing history, they were writing scripture. As the trial continued, the evidence multiplied like shadows. From hidden chambers in Csejte, soldiers brought wooden racks, whips, iron pincers, each marked with stains that no one dared name aloud. They also brought bones, hundreds of them, small and fragile, unearthed from beneath the castle floor. The priests crossed themselves. Thurzo turned away, his jaw tight. "Write it," he ordered. "All of it." The scribes obeyed, their quills bleeding ink like open wounds. Yet behind the curtain of justice, politics danced its careful waltz. The Habsburg king owed debts to the Bathory family, debts of gold and loyalty that could not be repaid with coin. To execute Elizabeth would ignite war between Hungary and Transylvania. To acquit her would be to invite scandal beyond repair. So the king chose a middle path: silence. She would be found guilty in spirit, but not in law. Her name would be erased, her castle sealed, her fortune divided among the crown and the church. She would live not as a countess, but as a ghost locked within her own walls. And so the court delivered its judgment. Let the Lady Elizabeth Bathory be confined for the remainder of her natural life, within her own chambers at Csejte Castle. Let no man or woman speak her name in honor henceforth. The verdict was read aloud on a night of heavy snow. The flames in the torches hissed, as if the air itself recoiled from the words. No one cheered. No one dared. Outside, however, the story began to spread like wildfire through the frozen countryside. Farmers told it by candlelight, the countess, who drank the blood of virgins. Merchants carried it across borders, dressing it in new colors. In Vienna, she became the Blood Queen. In Prague, the Scarlet Widow. In Poland, the Vampire of the Carpathians. Each retelling added something new: a ritual, a mirror, a chalice. Truth was no longer the point. Fear was. And fear, unlike flesh, does not decay. Months later, a Jesuit scholar named Father Matthias was sent to compile the records. He read every testimony, every confession, every rumor, and wrote, "Whether these things be true or not, they reveal the sickness of our age, for men crave monsters as much as they crave salvation." He warned that such tales would outlive the church itself, that they would haunt generations. He was right. In the centuries to come, Elizabeth Bathory's story would be retold in countless forms, each more sensational than the last. She would be woven into the mythology of the vampire, the seductress, the immortal femme fatale, and somewhere in the heart of it all, the real woman, the lonely, brilliant, and broken soul, would disappear completely. The trial at Bitcha ended quietly. The scribes packed away their scrolls. The priests whispered their prayers. But history, once written, does not sleep. Within months, copies of the records began to circulate secretly among the nobility. Each reader found what they wished to see: proof of evil, justification for patriarchy, or warning against vanity. The countess had become all things at once: villain, victim, myth. As winter faded into spring, Judge Thurzo rode past Csejte Castle one last time. The fortress loomed above him, silent and black against the twilight sky. He thought of the woman imprisoned within, of the cries he had heard on that dreadful night of arrest. Was she still screaming? Still alive? He never found out, but as he rode away, he glanced back and saw something that made his blood run cold: a flicker of light in one of the high windows, like a candle burning where no one should be. He crossed himself and spurred his horse into the dark. It was said that on that same night, the villagers below heard a bell ring from the tower, a bell that had been silent for years. No one dared climb to see who had rung it. And so, the legend grew. Elizabeth Bathory, noblewoman, torturer, witch, vampire had ceased to be a person. She had become an idea, and ideas, once born in blood, are immortal. When the fires of the trial finally burned out, the embers of legend began to glow. The name Elizabeth Bathory no longer belonged to history, it belonged to imagination. In the taverns of Pressburg, storytellers began whispering her tale to candle-lit crowds. They spoke of a lady so beautiful that mirrors bent to her will, a woman who had bartered her soul to remain forever young. They said that when she was finally sealed in her chamber, the stones wept red for 40 nights, and that the moon refused to rise over Csejte ever again. In truth, the real woman lay in darkness, starving, shivering, and mortal. But the world beyond her walls had already decided that mortals were too simple a story. So it made her something else. By the time her body was cold, her image had crossed borders faster than any messenger. In Vienna, pamphlets illustrated her as a serpent-crowned queen holding a chalice brimming with blood. The church distributed these drawings as moral warnings to teach noble women humility, to remind peasants of divine order. Each sermon gave her new life. Each illustration sharpened her teeth a little more. In Prague, alchemists and scholars debated her immortality. Could blood preserve beauty? Was there truth beneath the superstition? One scholar, Dr. Johann Pretorius, even claimed to have visited the ruins of Csejte, where he collected what he called vital essences from the soil, believing it still pulsed with her energy. He wrote in his journal, "The Lady Bathory was not a devil but a seeker, one who desired what all men desire, the conquest of time." The church banned his writings, but by then they had already been copied and smuggled across Europe. Meanwhile, the peasants of Upper Hungary kept their own version of the tale darker, closer to home. Old women told their grandchildren that if they wandered near the castle after sunset, the Countess would appear, her gown flowing like a river of blood. She would ask for a comb, or a mirror, or the name of their first love, and whoever answered would vanish by morning. In winter, shepherds swore they saw a woman's shadow move through the snow, leaving no footprints. At dawn, the animals would be found drained of blood. To the peasants, she was no longer human. She was a warning, a hunger that walked. By the late 17th century, her story had crossed the Carpathians into Transylvania, a land already steeped in superstition. There, her legend intertwined with the local tales of the Strigoi, the dead who fed on the living. A generation later, in 1725, the word vampire first appeared in European texts. Scholars traced the phenomenon to the Balkans, but the image, the noble who drinks blood to defy death, had a face already. A woman's face. A Bathory face. From that moment on, her legacy bled into folklore like ink into water. In Germany, Gothic poets wrote of the Crimson Bride. In France, philosophers used her as a metaphor, the embodiment of aristocratic decay. And in England, by the 19th century, her name whispered through literature's most haunted corridors. Writers like Sheridan Le Fanu reimagined her as Carmilla, the beautiful vampire who preyed on young women. Later, Bram Stoker would draw from her myth for his immortal creation. Dracula, the Transylvanian noble, whose thirst defied God and time alike. Through ink and imagination, Elizabeth Bathory lived again, not as a prisoner, but as a queen of the undead. Yet, as her legend grew, so too did the silence around the truth. Few remembered that the evidence against her had been built on testimonies extracted by torture, that no body was ever presented, that her guilt was as political as it was moral. Historians centuries later began to ask, was she truly a murderer, or merely a woman crushed beneath the weight of power she was never meant to wield? One scholar, Dr. Laszlo Nagy, wrote in 1895, if Elizabeth Bathory had been born a man, she would have been called a warrior. Because she was a woman, she was called a monster. But the world did not want complexity, it wanted horror. And so, the myth endured. Tourists began visiting the ruins of Csejte Castle, climbing its blackened stairs, whispering her name into the wind. Some swore they heard a woman laugh among the stones. Others said that when thunder rolled, The walls bled rain as dark as wine. In nearby towns, her sigil, the Bathory crest, was banned from church doors, yet carved secretly into tavern beams, believed to bring luck to those who feared the night. The contradiction was complete. She was damned and desired, cursed and worshipped, hated and adored. Centuries turned. Empires rose and fell. The world moved from candlelight to electricity, from superstition to science. But still, the Countess did not rest. In the early 1900s, silent films resurrected her as a pale figure in lace and shadow. In the 1960 seconds, horror cinema claimed her, as its dark muse blood dripping from her hands as violins wailed. She became not just history, but iconography, the eternal woman, punished for wanting too much. Feminist writers reinterpreted her as a symbol of defiance, the embodiment of female rage caged by patriarchy. Others saw her as the ultimate cautionary tale, the cost of vanity, the corruption of privilege. Through every retelling, she adapted, survived, evolved. Monsters d. Legends transform. In modern Hungary, scholars excavating Csejte's ruins found no trace of her grave, only stones blackened by fire, walls etched with ancient scratches, names, prayers, pleas. A local historian, holding one of the stones, said to a reporter, "People still come here to ask her for beauty, for strength, for power." Even now, 4 centuries after her death, her myth persists because it is not only about her, it is about the dark reflection we all carry, the part of humanity that seeks control, perfection, and eternity, no matter the cost. At night, the castle is empty. Only the wind speaks, rushing through its corridors like the breath of something waiting. And sometimes, when the moonlight cuts across the stones, travelers say they see her shadow tall, poised, watching, not weeping, not haunting, simply waiting, waiting for the next century to remember her again. To find that face, one must look past the Gothic fog, the pamphlets, and the horror that centuries have layered upon her name. One must return to the world that created her, a world of power, faith, and fear. Hungary in the 16th century was not a land of peace. It was a scar carved between 2 empires. To the west, the Habsburg crown ruled with cold divine authority. To the east, the Ottoman crescent burned across the plains. Between them lay the borderlands, noble families who bled for survival and thrived through cruelty. The Bathorys were among the most powerful of these families. They were kings in all but name, warriors, judges, voivodes. Their castles dotted the Carpathians like black thorns. And Elizabeth was their child, born into privilege, yes, but also into madness. Her earliest years were steeped in brutality. She grew up watching men tortured for treason, thieves whipped until their flesh came apart. Such sights were not aberrations, they were law. To a noble child of that era, violence was not evil. It was order. It was how the world explained itself. Historians would later note that Elizabeth's uncle was rumored to be a Satanist, her aunt a sadist who mutilated servants for pleasure. Whether these tales were truth or gossip, they formed the soil in which her childhood grew. Imagine a young girl, clever beyond her years, walking marble corridors slick with candlelight, hearing screams echo from the dungeons below and being told it was justice. That is where her story truly begins. But Elizabeth was not merely a product of cruelty. She was also a product of intellect. Unlike most women of her time, she could read and write fluently in Latin, German, and Hungarian. She studied mathematics, philosophy, even the early science of medicine. Her tutors described her as brilliant and cold, a mind sharper than a blade, with a curiosity that unnerved even her teachers. She questioned everything: God, nobility, the purpose of suffering. But such questions were dangerous in a world built on obedience. So she learned to hide them behind silence, behind charm, behind a beauty that others mistook for submission. Then came marriage. At 15, she was wedded to Ferenc Nadezhdy, a soldier famed for his cruelty toward Ottoman captives. He was older, battle-hardened, a man raised to see compassion as weakness. For him, their marriage was a political alliance, a union of two dynasties that could rule half of Hungary. For Elizabeth, it was a cage gilded in armor. At their wedding, guests feasted for days, while prisoners were impaled outside the castle gates as celebration. Such was nobility, a theater of horror masquerading as grandeur. Ferenc left soon after to fight the Turks, and Elizabeth remained in the castle, surrounded by servants, soldiers, and silence. She became the lady of Csejte Castle, responsible for hundreds of lives to feed them, punish them, rule them. She wielded absolute power long before she ever shed blood. Here, psychology and history begin to intertwine like two serpents. Elizabeth's isolation bred obsession. Her husband's absence taught her self-reliance, but also a deep, unspoken resentment. The court expected her to be dutiful, pious, invisible. Instead, she ruled. She managed estates, commanded servants, and even corresponded with nobles as an equal, something few women dared. But each assertion of power came with a price. Rumors. She is too proud. She speaks like a man. She has the devil's temper. In a society where obedience was virtue, her intelligence was interpreted as sin. Some historians now argue that the image of the Blood Countess was less about blood and more about patriarchy. The accusations began, they note, only after her husband's death, when Elizabeth, now a widow, controlled vast lands and refused to remarry. Her independence threatened the crown. Her wealth tempted the church. And so, whispers began. First, that she mistreated her servants. Then, that she practiced witchcraft. Finally, that she bathed in the blood of virgins. In the age of superstition, it was the perfect weapon. Invisible, impossible to disprove, yet powerful enough to destroy. Yet there is also a darker truth, one that no revision can erase. Something did happen at Csejte. Witnesses were real. The screams were heard. Bodies were found. The question is not whether cruelty existed, but how far it reached and why. Psychologists who studied her case centuries later describe a pattern of escalating control, the slow transformation from discipline to domination, from punishment to ritual. She may not have believed she was bathing in blood for youth, but perhaps she believed that pain was purity, that fear kept order. In a world that equated authority with violence, she may have simply followed the logic she had been born into, taking it to its absolute, horrifying extreme. Imagine her standing at the balcony of her castle, watching the snow fall over the frozen bodies of those who served her, not as a demon, but as a woman convinced of her own righteousness. That is the face behind the monster, conviction without mercy. And yet, in the fragments of her letters preserved despite centuries of censorship, there are moments of vulnerability. In one, she writes to her cousin, "I have been taught that virtue lies in obedience. Yet all who obey me suffer, and all who defy me perish. What then is virtue?" In another, they say, "A woman must be either saint or sinner. Perhaps I am neither, only the reflection of the men who made me." To understand Elizabeth Bathory is to understand contradiction. She was both victim and tyrant, both product and perpetrator of her age. She embodied the twisted ideals of a society that worshipped purity but practiced brutality. Her castle was a church of mirrors, each servant, each death, each whisper reflecting not just her madness, but the madness of the world around her. When she punished the weak, she was repeating what the strong had done to her. When she sought eternal youth, she was fighting the only war a woman could in her time, the war against invisibility. And when history condemned her, it did so with the same lust for blood she was accused of having. The true Elizabeth, stripped of myth, remains unreachable. Was she a sadist, a scapegoat, a symbol? The evidence answers all three, and none completely. But perhaps that is the lesson. Monsters are not born in shadows. They are born in daylight, in the courts, in the pews, in the castles where cruelty is law and mercy is weakness. Elizabeth Bathory did not create her world, She merely reflected it in blood. The legend of Elizabeth Bathory did not die with her. It multiplied. Like blood spilled on cold stone, it spread, soaking into the centuries that followed, each retelling darker, grander, more convenient for those who needed a monster. But before it became myth, it was politics. When the investigators arrived at Csejte Castle in 1610, Hungary was a country fracturing under pressure. The Ottoman Empire still pressed from the south. The Habsburgs, desperate for control, sought to tighten their grip on the Hungarian nobility. And in the middle of this fragile balance stood one of the most powerful women in Europe, a widow commanding vast lands, wealth beyond measure, and an army of loyal servants. To destroy her was not just justice, it was strategy. Count Jerzy Thurzo, the man who led the investigation, was both accuser and beneficiary. Once Elizabeth was imprisoned, her lands were quietly divided. Her estates, her gold, her influence, all absorbed into the hands of those who had condemned her. Even the king himself, Matthias II, owed her a large debt of gold. After her arrest, that debt was quietly erased. History is written by the victors and, in this case, by the creditors. Yet to dismiss her story as mere fabrication would be too easy and too comfortable. The testimonies recorded in those trials speak with the trembling clarity of those who had seen horror firsthand. Women servants, peasants, accomplices described the same rituals again and again. Girls lured by promises of work, locked away, beaten, drained, candles flickering over iron instruments, laughter echoing from behind oak doors. It is tempting to imagine they lied, coerced by fear or greed. But their voices scattered across hundreds of pages tremble with the same rhythm: grief, guilt, terror. Perhaps the truth, as always, lies somewhere between justice and propaganda, between a crime and its exploitation. To understand how such a woman could exist, one must understand the machinery that made her possible. 16th century Europe was a theater of cruelty. Public executions were entertainment. Witch hunts burned through villages like fever. Kings tortured enemies in the name of faith. Violence was not deviation, it was devotion. And for noble families, blood was not sacred, it was currency. Men earned power through battle. Women preserved it through lineage. When a woman like Elizabeth, brilliant and unyielding, sought to wield power beyond what the crown allowed, she became unnatural by definition. If she was not submissive, she must be wicked. If she was intelligent, she must be cunning. If she ruled alone, she must be cursed. In that sense, the Blood Countess was not born from murder, she was born from fear. Fear of the woman who refused to kneel. Centuries later, feminist historians would revisit her case and ask a forbidden question. What if Elizabeth Bathory had been a man? If a nobleman had tortured servants for discipline, would he have been branded the devil or merely strict? If a general had shed blood for control, would he have been accused of witchcraft or praised for keeping order? Even her most grotesque legend bathing in blood can be read as metaphor. In an age where a woman's worth was tied to her youth, beauty, and fertility, perhaps the story reflected society's own obsession. A woman punished for daring to preserve what the world valued most in her. Elizabeth may never have bathed in blood, but the myth reveals that Europe itself already worshipped it. Still, beyond politics and gender, there remains something deeper, a psychological portrait of power consuming itself. Authority isolates. Isolation breeds delusion. And delusion, when armored by wealth, becomes tyranny. For decades, Elizabeth's commands were law. No one questioned her. When reality ceases to oppose the will, the mind begins to erode. Those around her enabled every cruelty, servants too frightened to disobey, nobles too indebted to intervene. Every system that could have stopped her was built to protect her instead. In that vacuum, empathy dies. And once empathy dies, horror becomes habit. Elizabeth's castle did not fall because she was evil. It fell because no one dared to tell her she was wrong. There is a letter, preserved in fragments, allegedly written by a priest after visiting her during imprisonment. Her eyes were not those of madness. They were the eyes of one who has looked too long into the mirror and found not herself, but the world. It is a haunting image, the mirror. For every era since, the myth of the Blood Countess has reflected something different. In the 17th century, she was the cautionary tale of a woman who defied God. In the 18th, she became a Gothic villainess, beautiful, damned, irresistible. In the 19th, she was reborn in literature as the proto-vampire, the eternal seductress feeding on youth. In the 20th, she symbolized female rage, a woman devouring patriarchy itself. And today, she is a case study, a question mark in the history of evil. We keep resurrecting her because we recognize something of ourselves in her reflection. Ambition, loneliness, the hunger for control, the refusal to be powerless in a world built to crush the powerless. But reflection cuts both ways. Every generation that retells her story does so to reassure itself. We are not like her. We have learned. We are civilized now. Yet her story whispers otherwise. The instruments of cruelty may have changed shape, but the impulse remains. It lives in the boardrooms where greed disguises itself as progress. In the prisons where suffering is justified as order. In the algorithms that feed on our fears for profit. Elizabeth Castle was not destroyed. It simply moved brick by brick into the heart of modernity. If she were alive today, what would she see? A world that still worships youth, still punishes women for ambition, still disguises cruelty as virtue. Would she recognize her own reflection? Or would she laugh at our hypocrisy? Perhaps she would say, "You still bleed your daughters. You just call it culture now." The line between her and us, between the monster and the mirror, grows thinner with every retelling. And that is why her legend endures, not because it satisfies our horror, but because it exposes it. When Elizabeth Bathory died in 1614, her cell was sealed, her name erased from church records. But the stain could not be washed away. Centuries later, her story still clings to the stones of Csejte, whispering through the cracks. Power corrupts. Fear creates monsters. And every age builds its own. "Monsters," the narrator whispers, as the camera fades to the silhouette of the castle under stormlight, "are not born. They are reflections of us, of our desires, of our failures." The wind howls. The snow begins to fall. The screen fades to black. The last night of the Countess. The wind that had once howled through the towers of Csejte Castle had grown old and tired. It no longer screamed against the stone. It sighed like an old mourner keeping vigil over the dead. In the highest chamber of the northern tower, behind walls bricked and sealed, Elizabeth Bathory sat alone. No throne, no velvet, no mirrors, only the gray breath of winter seeping through a crack in the stones. It was the year 1614, and the woman who had once ruled half of northern Hungary now ruled only silence. The servants who brought her scraps of food did so without words. They slid the wooden tray through a narrow slot in the wall and left, never meeting her eyes. She was forbidden letters, visitors, prayer, only one candle at a time. For 4 years she had lived like this. 4 years of stone, of shadows, of her own mind echoing back at her like a cruel companion. Outside, the world moved on. The estates she once owned were divided. The peasants whispered prayers not for her, but for the ghosts said to haunt her halls. The king slept easier, knowing her debt was erased, and the church declared victory over sin. But within these walls, time had stopped. They had taken everything from her, her freedom, her jewels, her mirrors, but they could not take her thoughts. And so, she turned inward, deeper and deeper into the labyrinth of her own memory. She remembered the sound of bells from her youth, how they once rang across the Carpathian hills, calling the faithful to Mass. She remembered her mother's face, stern and unblinking, as she taught her that mercy was a weakness. She remembered her father, a general who ordered men flayed for disobedience, yet kissed her forehead before battle. Cruelty had not shocked her. It had cradled her. Even now, in her darkest hour, Elizabeth did not think of herself as a monster. To her, she had only done what the world had taught her to do: command, control, survive. She whispered, "If I am damned, then it is by the rules you made." The candle flickered. A single drop of wax fell and hardened like a tear. For a moment, she thought she heard voices, the faint laughter of her handmaidens, the soft murmur of courtly music. But when she turned, there was nothing. Only the cold, patient breathing of the stones. Sometimes she dreamt of her victims, not as corpses, but as girls laughing, alive, untouched by her cruelty. They moved through her dreams like dancers in red silk, and every time she reached out to touch them, they turned to blood. She would wake trembling, clutching the rosary she was no longer allowed to pray with. The beads had long since cracked, worn smooth by desperate fingers. The guards outside spoke of strange sounds, whispers in languages they did not know, footsteps pacing when no one was moving. One swore he heard singing. Another claimed the locked chamber smelled of roses one night, though no flowers grew within 50 miles. Perhaps madness had become her final disguise. Or perhaps the legends were right that something had taken root within her, something not entirely human. But if Elizabeth was haunted, she was haunted not by spirits, but by memory. There was one last record, a note scrawled by the priest who was allowed to visit her for confession once a year. He described her as pale but composed, her hair silvering, her gaze as sharp as on the day of her arrest. When he asked if she sought forgiveness, she smiled faintly and said, "Forgiveness is for those who regret. I only regret that I loved power too little." It was a chilling phrase, not pride, not remorse, but the weary admission of someone who had seen the inside of her own soul and found it hollow. Night after night, she sat in silence, tracing invisible shapes on the wall, the map of her past. Each scar on the stone, each whisper of the wind was a ghost come home. She remembered Ferenc, her husband, riding off to war. His armor gleamed like dawn, his laughter hard as iron. She had loved him once, or perhaps only the power he represented. When the messenger brought word of his death, she had not wept. Instead, she had ordered the bell tower rung for 3 days straight, not to mourn, but to remind the world that the name Nadesty still commanded the heavens. Now, even those bells had fallen silent. One night, the last night, the candle burned lower than ever before. She felt the air grow thick, as if the walls themselves were breathing with her. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from fatigue, the kind that comes when the body has finally made peace with death. She spoke softly to no one. "Do you hear it? The sound beyond the walls?" The wind moaned, carrying faint echoes, voices of the past, the servants, the screams, the prayers. For the first time, Elizabeth did not resist them. She listened, and in that chorus of the damned, she thought she heard her own name, not in accusation, but in acknowledgement. They were bound to her, as she to them, an endless chain forged by pain, by power, by history itself. The legends would call her a murderer, a demon, a vampire. But as the flame sank into darkness, Elizabeth whispered her own epitaph, "I was what you made me." And with that, she closed her eyes. In the morning, the guards found her still, seated by the wall, her hands folded as though in prayer. No struggle, no mark. The candle had burned itself out. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the castle towers, painting the snow crimson. The villagers below said it looked like the sky itself was bleeding. They buried her in secret. No tomb, no name, only stone upon stone, as if the earth itself wished to forget. But legends do not stay buried. For centuries afterward, travelers spoke of seeing a pale woman wandering the battlements of Csejte. Sometimes she was dressed in black, sometimes in white, always silent, always watching. Some said she sought redemption. Others claimed she guarded her secret treasure, the blood that once preserved her beauty. But the truth is simpler and sadder. She remains because we keep her alive. Every time her name is spoken, every story retold, every whisper of the Blood Countess, another candle lights itself in that forgotten room. Elizabeth Bathory never escaped her prison. We simply built new walls for her, inside our imagination, and as the final words fade, the narrator's voice returns low, reverent, unflinching. History does not remember monsters. It remembers mirrors and the reflection we dare not face. The screen turns black. Then slowly, white text appears. Csejte Castle still stands. Some say, on cold nights, you can still hear her footsteps. The snows of Csejte have long melted, the castle's stones crumbling like bones under centuries of silence. Yet her name, Elizabeth Bathory, endures. Not as a queen, not even as a countess, but as something far older, a myth. The people of Hungary still whisper her story. Children dare each other to climb the hill where her fortress once stood. Tourists walk its ruins, holding candles, hoping for a glimpse of her ghost. And every time they speak her name, the legend stirs again, soft as a heartbeat beneath the earth. 400 years have passed, and still she refuses to die. She has become an archetype, half history, half nightmare, living on in ink and imagination. In the 19th century, when Europe discovered its hunger for the macabre, her shadow returned in another form, the vampire. Writers like Sheridan Le Fanu and later Bram Stoker drew from the whispers of her cruelty, her beauty, her isolation, her taste for blood to create Carmilla and Dracula. But unlike Stoker's Count, Elizabeth's hunger was not for blood itself. It was for control over time, over decay, over fear. And in that sense, she was more human than any monster fiction could conjure. Because what she truly feared was not death, it was irrelevance. Every empire falls. Every beauty fades. Every name is eventually swallowed by the dust it once ruled. Elizabeth had seen it all, kings rise and rot, battles won only to be forgotten. To her, eternity was not divine. It was defiance. Perhaps that is why she sought it in blood. Not as a potion, but as a metaphor. Blood was youth. Blood was loyalty. Blood was power. In her world, everything sacred was written in it. When she bathed her hands in it, if she ever truly did, she was not feeding vanity. She was performing a ritual older than her faith, older than the church that condemned her. A ritual that said, I will not be erased. And yet, history erased her anyway, or tried to. Her family name was stripped from records. Her portraits destroyed. Her burial site hidden beneath the earth. But stories, like blood, have their own way of seeping through stone. It is said that one surviving portrait of her pale skin, black gown, eyes that seem to follow you, was smuggled out of Hungary by a loyal servant. It hung in secret for generations, passed between families like a curse. Each owner claimed to have dreamt of the same thing, a woman standing at the end of their bed, watching, always silent, always waiting. In the centuries that followed, Elizabeth's image evolved. To the Enlightenment, she was the embodiment of irrational superstition. To the Romantics, she was a tragic figure, beauty devoured by obsession. To the Victorians, she was the perfect horror, noble, feminine, and deadly. To the modern era, she became something else entirely, a symbol of how society builds and breaks women who defy it, of how power, when wielded by a woman, is always mistaken for sin, and of how the thirst for immortality in fame, in beauty, in legacy, still consumes us all. When Hollywood discovered her, they turned her into spectacle. Films and novels painted her as the first female vampire, dripping with diamonds and blood. Her name became synonymous with the forbidden, the marriage of beauty and death. But the truth is less glamorous and far more haunting. Elizabeth Bathory was a woman trapped in the paradox of her time, expected to rule like a man, yet obey like a child, to be divine in grace, yet monstrous in will. When she broke those boundaries, the world broke her back, and then it built a legend from her bones. Even now, psychologists study her case. Some call her a sociopath, a sadist, a narcissist. Others see signs of trauma, isolation, paranoia, symptoms of a mind rotting in its own reflection. But perhaps none of those labels matter. Perhaps she is more than diagnosis or damnation. Perhaps she is a question. How far will we go to stay powerful? How much will we sacrifice to never be forgotten? And at what point does the pursuit of immortality become indistinguishable from madness? When night falls over the ruins of Csejte, locals say the wind still carries her laughter. Not cruel, not mocking, almost wistful, as though she knows her victory not in life, but in legend. While her enemies are forgotten, her name lives on in every whispered tale, every film, every story like this one. Perhaps, in the end, that was what she wanted all along. A scholar once wrote, Elizabeth Bathory did not bathe in blood to stay young. She bathed in myth to stay alive. And so she has. Every retelling, each historian, filmmaker, or storyteller who resurrects her feeds that myth anew. We have become her servants, carrying the memory she forged in terror. We are the voices that echo in her sealed chamber, centuries later. In trying to destroy her, we made her eternal. The narrator's voice softens now, no longer condemning, no longer afraid. The Blood Countess, the Lady of Csejte, a woman of her time and of ours. Her sin was not that she killed, but that she refused to vanish quietly. The camera pans out from her empty chamber to the castle ruins, bathed in moonlight. The wind carries, whispers Latin prayers mixed with Hungarian laments. The screen fades to black, but her voice lingers faint, like a breath against the ear. Tell them I lived. Silence. Then, the closing narration returns deep, resonant, like a final heartbeat beneath history. From the bloodied halls of Csejte to the silver screens of the modern world, Elizabeth Bathory has outlived them all. Not because she was a monster, but because she showed us how easily civilization becomes one. The music swells a low choir, half sacred, half cursed. Flickering images of art, film, and history blur together. Paintings of noblewomen, vampire fangs, medieval torture, modern beauty ads, until they all look the same. Every age has its blood rituals. We just call them by gentler names. The title appears one last time. Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, followed by a voice steady, dark, sincere. If her story has haunted you tonight, don't look away. Like, share, and subscribe for the forgotten truths of history's darkest queens and the reflection they still hold to our world. Fade out. The sound of a heartbeat. Then nothing.